Hello friends, I've got some truly amazing stories for you today. Before we dive into today's video, check out some of your amazing comments. I really appreciate them. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for your support. And now let's get started. My name is Glenn Miller, and what happened to me back in 2017 in the Cherokee National Forest still crawls under my skin like maggots in rotting wood. I was working as a park ranger then, keeping an eye on the trails and making sure the campers didn't wander too far off marked paths. But some things in those woods don't care about marked paths or human boundaries. I remember the humidity that morning with visceral clarity, heavy enough to make my shirt cling to my back like a second skin, damp and suffocating. The coffee I had was cheap instant stuff, gritty and sour, leaving a metallic aftertaste that seemed to coat my tongue for hours. The sun was still low, shining through the hardwoods and casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with their own malevolent life. Everything felt wrong from the moment I stepped outside the ranger station, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I was alone that day because my buddy Travis had called in sick. He claimed he'd eaten some bad meatloaf at a diner in town, but his voice had sounded strange over the phone, hollow and distant like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. I teased him about being delicate, and he told me to mind my own business, but there was no humor in it. Usually we joked like that to keep things light when we dealt with lost hikers and the occasional drunk fishermen who wandered into restricted areas. But that morning, even our banter felt forced, like we were both trying to convince ourselves that everything was normal. The ranger station itself seemed different that day. The fluorescent lights flickered more than usual, casting intermittent shadows that made the familiar space feel alien. The radio crackled with more static than normal, and twice I thought I heard voices in the white noise, whispers that made the hair on my arm stand on end. The coffee maker gurgled and wheezed like something dying, and the instant coffee granules looked like tiny insects floating in the murky brown liquid. I hiked out from the station around dawn, following the trail markers and checking that the signs warning folks to stay on the main paths were still intact. Sometimes kids like to tear them down as pranks, but lately we'd been finding the signs damaged in ways that didn't look human. Deep gouges in the metal as if something with claws had tried to shred them. Bite marks that didn't match any known animal in the area. The forest felt different as I walked deeper into it. The usual morning chorus of birds was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Even the insects were quiet, and the lack of buzzing mosquitoes should have been a relief, but instead it filled me with dread. Nature abhors a vacuum, and when the small creatures go silent, it usually means something bigger and more dangerous has moved into their territory. I had my radio, crackling with intermittent static, my lunch consisting of a ham sandwich that already felt soggy in the humid air, a few pretzels that had gone stale, and an apple that bore strange brown spots I didn't remember seeing when I packed it. My standard issue flashlight felt heavier than usual in my belt, and I found myself checking it obsessively, clicking it on and off to make sure it still worked. I wore my usual uniform, but the fabric seemed to chafe against my skin in ways it never had before, and my old boots with soles worn thin felt like they might fall apart at any moment. Every step sent small vibrations up through my legs, and I could feel the forest floor yielding beneath my feet in ways that seemed unnatural, almost organic, like walking on something that was still alive. I thought the biggest challenge that day would be swatting mosquitoes and avoiding poison ivy. How naive I was. How utterly, tragically naive. The trees seemed to close in as I walked, their branches reaching across the path like gnarled fingers trying to snare unwary travelers. Spanish moss hung from the oaks like funeral shrouds, swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. The air itself seemed thicker, harder to breathe, carrying scents that didn't belong in any healthy forest. There was something sweet and cloying underneath the usual earthiness, something that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. Around 9, I stopped to drink some water near a clearing where the old fire tower used to stand. The tower had been dismantled years back after a windstorm made it too unstable, but the locals whispered that wasn't the real reason. They said things had been seen from that tower, things that watched back when you tried to observe them. Now only the concrete base remained with rusty bolts sticking up like broken teeth, stained dark with what might have been rust but looked disturbingly like dried blood in the morning light. The clearing itself felt wrong. Grass grew in strange patterns, forming rings and spirals that hurt to look at directly. Wildflowers bloomed out of season. their colors too bright, almost fluorescent like warning signs in nature's lexicon. Bees should have been swarming them, but the insects gave the flowers a wide berth, as if they knew something humans had forgotten. I noticed something odd about the silence then, really noticed it for the first time. Normally you'd hear birds chirping their morning songs, maybe a squirrel scampering through the canopy, the steady hum of insects going about their business, but it felt quiet. Unnaturally quiet, as if everything around had decided to hold its breath and wait for something terrible to pass. The silence had weight to it, pressing down on me like a physical thing. When I cleared my throat, the sound seemed to echo longer than it should have, bouncing back from the trees in strange, distorted ways. I shrugged it off at first, trying to rationalize the unease growing in my gut. Figured maybe a hawk had flown overhead and the little creatures were playing it safe. But hawks don't silence entire sections of forest, and the quiet zone seemed to move with me as I continued down the trail. Whatever was causing it was following me, keeping pace, staying just out of sight. I moved on, taking the North Spur Trail, a lesser-used path that led into dense undergrowth where the canopy grew so thick that noon could feel like twilight. I had my map and compass, but I knew this area by heart. I'd been stationed here for 6 months, and I felt confident navigating the ridges and hollows. I even had nicknames for certain landmarks, a way of making the wilderness feel more familiar, more human. A charred stump I called Old Smoky stood like a blackened sentinel, its hollow center yawning like a mouth frozen in an eternal scream. A cluster of twisted pines I called the Three Sisters grew in an impossible configuration, their trunks braided together as if they'd been tortured into that shape. But that morning, even familiar landmarks seemed different, more threatening. Old Smoky's hollow seemed deeper, darker, and I could swear I heard something rustling inside it when I passed. The Three Sisters cast shadows that moved independently of the wind, reaching toward me with finger-like projections. The very ground beneath my feet felt unstable, spongy in places where it should have been firm, as if something underneath was slowly decomposing. The trail markers themselves told a story I was only beginning to read. Several were damaged beyond normal wear, scratched and gouged by something with claws longer and stronger than any animal I knew lived in these woods. One sign warning hikers about unstable terrain had been completely shredded, hanging in metal strips like silver streamers. The damage was too fresh to be weather-related, too systematic to be random vandalism. As I reached a spot near a shallow creek that normally bubbled and gurgled with cheerful mountain water, I noticed the stream itself had changed. The water ran darker than usual, with an oily sheen that reflected the sky in wrong colors. It smelled different too, carrying that same sweet, sick odor I'd detected in the air, but concentrated now, almost overwhelming. Small fish floated belly up in the stagnant pools, their scales dulled and eyes clouded white. Something was poisoning the watershed, or something poisonous was living in it. That's when I noticed the footprints, 2 sets, maybe 3, pressed deep into the muddy bank. At first glance, they looked human, but something was off about the spacing, the depth, the shape. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced, and there were marks that might have been claws extending beyond where human toenails would end. The prints led away from the creek toward a dense thicket of mountain laurel and rhododendron, disappearing into shadows so deep they seemed solid. Near the prints, I found scattered gear that made my blood run cold. A backpack hung snagged on a branch, its fabric torn in parallel lines that spoke of claws rather than thorns. The damage was too precise, too deliberate. A crumpled energy bar wrapper lay nearby, but the foil had been punctured by what looked like teeth marks. A half-full water bottle stood upright as though someone had placed it there deliberately, but the plastic bore similar puncture marks, and the water inside had turned the same dark color as the creek. It looked like a makeshift camp that had been left in a hurry, but not the kind of hurry that comes from forgetting something at home or deciding to change locations. This was the hurry of panic, of people running for their lives and failing to escape whatever pursued them. I called on the radio, my voice steady despite the chill crawling up my spine. "Base, this is Glenn. I've got abandoned gear at mile marker 7 on North Spur Trail. Possible missing hikers." Static greeted me at first, harsh and full of interference that almost sounded like screaming if you listened too closely. Then a faint reply came through, distorted and barely intelligible, telling me to keep them posted and investigate further. The voice on the other end sounded strained, nervous, like they knew something I didn't but couldn't say it over the radio. I stepped carefully around the gear, photographing everything with my phone before disturbing the scene. The camera's flash seemed weaker than usual, and several photos came out strangely dark despite the relatively bright morning light. In some images, shadows fell in directions that defied the sun's position, and in one photograph I could swear I saw something crouched in the background that hadn't been there when I took the picture. Looking for some identification, I searched through the torn backpack, finding a driver's license in a side pocket that hadn't been completely shredded. The plastic was warm to the touch, unnaturally so, and seemed to pulse with its own heat. The license belonged to a man named Diego Sanchez from Chattanooga, photographed smiling at the camera with no idea that his cheerful face would become evidence in something unspeakable. He looked to be in his 20s, probably a weekend hiker who'd ventured off the main trails looking for adventure. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd found more adventure than anyone should ever have to face. A light breeze picked up, carrying a smell that made my stomach lurch and my primitive brain scream warnings my conscious mind tried to ignore. It wasn't quite like anything I'd encountered before, but it triggered every prey instinct evolution had built into human DNA. The closest comparison would be wet fur, but fur that had been soaked in something foul, something dead and rotting. Mixed with that was a musk so strong it seemed to coat the inside of my nostrils, and underneath it all the metallic tang of fresh blood. I followed the creek upstream, stepping carefully on the slippery rocks and trying not to think about what might be contaminating the water. The smell grew stronger with each step, and flies began to appear in increasing numbers. Big black ones that swarmed in clouds and seemed to watch me with an intelligence flies shouldn't possess. They landed on my skin despite my attempts to wave them away, and their touch burned like tiny brands. Past a cluster of ferns that grew in unnatural spirals, their fronds curled into patterns that hurt to look at directly, I spotted something that made my breath catch in my throat. At first I thought it was a pile of clothes someone had discarded, maybe a hiker who'd gone skinny dipping in the creek despite park regulations. But as I got closer, my trained eye began to pick out details that transformed confusion into horror. It was a body, twisted against a fallen log in a position that spoke of violence and terror. The man lay at an impossible angle, limbs bent in ways that suggested they'd been broken and rearranged. His shirt was not just torn but shredded, hanging in strips that revealed deep gouges in the flesh beneath. His pants were smeared with mud, but the mud was too dark, too red, and it carried that same sick, sweet smell that permeated the entire area. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. My hands shook as I forced myself to examine what remained of Diego Sanchez. His throat had been savagely mauled, torn open with a precision that spoke of predatory intelligence rather than random animal attack. The wound was too clean in places, too ragged in others, as if whatever had done this had taken its time, had enjoyed the process. But it was his eyes that haunted me most. They were still open, staring at something beyond the canopy, and in them I saw not just the terror of his final moments, but a knowledge, an understanding of what had killed him. They were the eyes of someone who had seen something that shouldn't exist, something that violated the natural order so completely that his mind had broken trying to process it. His hands were clenched into fists, and when I forced myself to examine them more closely, I found tufts of coarse, dark fur clutched in his fingers. The fur was unlike anything I'd seen on any animal native to Tennessee, thicker and oilier, with an almost reptilian quality to individual strands. Mixed with the fur were what looked like scales or hardened skin fragments, as if whatever he'd fought had been shedding pieces of itself. I backed away, my hands fumbling for the radio with fingers that refused to work properly. "Base, this is Glenn," I managed, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when my entire world was falling apart. "I found a deceased person, possible animal attack. I need immediate assistance and the coroner's office." The radio crackled with static for what felt like hours before a response came through. The voice was different this time, older, more serious, carrying an undertone that suggested this wasn't the first such call they'd received. They told me help was on the way, but that it might take an hour or more, because the roads were rough and the closest unit was still on the far side of the forest. An hour seemed like an eternity when you're standing next to evidence that something unnatural was hunting in these woods. I began checking the area for signs of whatever had done this, trying to think like the Park Service manual had taught me. Animal attacks follow patterns, leave specific types of evidence. Bears leave claw marks and tend to focus on certain body parts. Mountain lions attack the neck, and might drag their prey to a secluded location. Coyotes hunt in packs and leave multiple bite patterns. This was none of those things. The scene defied every classification I'd been trained to recognize. Diego's body hadn't been dragged anywhere, suggesting whatever killed him was confident enough to feed in place. But there were no signs of feeding, no missing flesh or organs that would indicate a hungry predator. The violence seemed purposeful but not practical, as if the killing itself had been the goal rather than obtaining food. The tracks around the body told a story I didn't want to read. They were deeper here, pressed into the soft earth with the weight of something substantial, but the spacing was all wrong. The gait too long for anything that should be walking on four legs, too short for something walking on two. Some prints looked almost human but stretched and distorted, as if human feet had been pulled like taffy into something longer and more predatory. As I waited for backup, crouched beside Diego's remains and trying not to breathe too deeply of the fetid air, I heard a rustling in the brush that made every nerve ending in my body scream danger. It wasn't the random movement of wind through leaves or the scurrying of small animals. This was deliberate, purposeful, the sound of something large moving through the undergrowth with predatory stealth. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative. "If someone's out there, we have a situation here. Stay put until the authorities arrive." The rustling stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like being wrapped in a suffocating blanket. Even the flies stopped buzzing, hanging motionless in the air like they were frozen in time. The absence of sound was more terrifying than any noise could have been, because it meant whatever was watching me was intelligent enough to recognize the threat in my voice and disciplined enough to go completely still. Then I saw it. A sudden flash of movement between the trees, something that shouldn't exist but undeniably did. I caught only a glimpse, but that glimpse burned itself into my memory with the clarity of a photograph. It was low-slung and muscular, built like a predator but wrong in every possible way. Its limbs were too long for its body, giving it a spider-like quality that triggered every primitive fear humans have carried since we first huddled around fires to keep the darkness at bay. The creature reminded me of a coyote in the same way, that a nightmare reminds you of reality, familiar enough to be recognizable but distorted beyond all reason. It was larger than any coyote had a right to be, with a narrower head that seemed designed for getting into tight spaces where prey might hide. Its fur was coarse and dark brown, matted with substances I didn't want to identify, and it moved with a fluid grace that spoke of perfect predatory adaptation. Before I could get a better look or even process what I was seeing, it slipped behind a massive oak tree, disappearing so completely it might have been absorbed into the bark itself. But I could still feel its presence, could sense its eyes on me with the certainty of someone who spent their life in the wilderness, learning to read the subtle signs of being watched. I knew coyotes, had encountered them dozens of times in my years as a ranger. They were typically shy animals, more afraid of humans than we were of them. They didn't behave like this, didn't stalk park rangers in broad daylight or leave mangled bodies in their wake. And this thing's proportions were all wrong, like a child's drawing where the artist had gotten confused about how the pieces fit together. I walked backward, every survival instinct inherited from 10,000 generations of human ancestors, screaming at me not to turn away from a predator. My throat felt dry as sand, and when I tried to speak, my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Let's not do anything stupid here." The word sounded pathetic even to me, a laughable attempt to impose human reason on something that existed outside the boundaries of human understanding. But speaking helped me focus, helped me remember that I was armed, that I had training, that I wasn't completely helpless. I had a service pistol, standard issue .40 caliber that I'd qualified with but never needed to use in the field. The weight of it on my hip had always been reassuring, a reminder that I could handle any situation that might arise. Now it felt inadequate, like bringing a fly swatter to fight a grizzly bear. But I unclipped the holster anyway, my fingers fumbling with the safety strap as adrenaline made my hands shake. The woods felt different now, heavier, as if the very air had thickened with malevolent intent. The undergrowth seemed to press in from all sides, creating a sense of claustrophobia that made it hard to breathe. Shadows moved independently of their sources, reaching toward me with grasping tendrils that might have been tricks of light or might have been something far worse. I stepped toward a patch of sunlight filtering through the canopy, thinking I'd have a clearer view and better field of fire if whatever was stalking me decided to attack. The light felt thin and weak, providing little comfort and no real safety. Even in direct sunlight, the shadows seemed too deep, too dark, as if they were holes torn in reality itself. Then I heard footsteps. Not the padding of animal paws or the rustle of something moving through leaves, but actual footsteps. They were faster than human pace should be, erratic in their rhythm, sometimes sounding bipedal, sometimes not. They circled around me in a pattern that spoke of intelligence, of tactical thinking, as if whatever was making them understood the concept of flanking maneuvers and was positioning itself for an optimal attack. A shout echoed through the trees, human and familiar. "Glenn, you out here?" I recognized the voice immediately, Daniel, another ranger who must have been dispatched when my radio call started sounding urgent. Relief flooded through me so suddenly I nearly fell to my knees. Daniel was older, more experienced, a 20-year veteran who'd dealt with everything these mountains could throw at a person. If anyone could help me make sense of what was happening, it was him. "Dan, over here," I called back, my voice cracking with emotion I didn't want to examine too closely. "Watch yourself. We've got a situation." I glimpsed Daniel's bright orange safety jacket as he appeared between two massive hickories, moving with the careful gait of someone who'd learned not to take the forest for granted. He looked confused and alarmed when he saw me crouched near Diego's body, my pistol drawn and my eyes scanning the tree line like a soldier in a combat zone. "Holy Christ," he said when he saw the corpse, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed too loud in the unnatural silence. He hurried to my side, keeping his voice low and his own rifle ready. Daniel had served in Vietnam before becoming a ranger, and he moved with the awareness of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on expecting the unexpected. "What did this?" he asked, kneeling beside Diego's remains and examining them with professional detachment. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking to the surrounding forest, and I knew he felt the same wrongness that was eating at my sanity. I shook my head, my voice barely steady. "Something that shouldn't exist. Not a normal predator, Dan. This thing's been stalking me, and I think there might be more than one." Before we could discuss it further, before I could warn him about what I'd seen in the shadows, a sudden blur of motion burst from the bushes with the explosive violence of a landmine detonating. The creature I'd glimpsed earlier launched itself forward with impossible speed, its movement so fluid and serpentine it seemed to flow rather than run. I fired a shot into the ground near its feet, hoping the noise and muzzle flash would scare it off the way it would any normal animal. Instead, the gunshot seemed to enrage it, and it came at Daniel with a snarling sound that set every tooth in my head on edge. The noise it made wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human, but something caught between the two that violated every natural law about how living things should sound. Daniel tried to raise his rifle, but the thing moved too fast, covering the distance between them in a single bound that defied physics. It knocked him off balance with an impact that sounded like a car crash, and they went down in a tangle of limbs and rustling clothes. I tried to get a clean shot, but they were moving too fast, rolling and struggling in a life-or-death embrace that gave me no clear target. I saw Daniel's face contort in agony as the creature's jaws found their mark. He screamed, the sound tearing from his throat with raw terror. "Get it off me!" and swung wildly with his rifle, trying to use it as a club. The weapon stock connected with the creature's skull with a sound like breaking wood, but it barely seemed to notice. I rushed in, adrenaline hammering in my veins like liquid fire, trying to get close enough for a point-blank shot that wouldn't risk hitting Daniel. Up close, the thing was even more horrifying than my brief glimpse had suggested. Its fur was coarse and matted, dark brown shot through with patches of diseased-looking bare skin. It smelled like a charnel house, like death and decay, and something else that made my lizard brain scream in recognition of an apex predator. The creature's eyes were the worst part. Small and intelligent, gleaming with a malevolent awareness that spoke of more than animal cunning. They were the eyes of something that understood what it was doing, that took pleasure in the hunt and the kill. Its ears were torn or misshapen, looking like they'd been chewed by something even more vicious. And its teeth were too sharp, too numerous, crowding its mouth in rows like a shark's. It had Daniel by the shoulder, its jaws clamped down with the crushing force of a bear trap. Blood soaked through Daniel's shirt and jacket, spreading in a dark stain that grew larger with each heartbeat. He struggled weakly, kicking at the creature's flank with boots that seemed to have no more effect than throwing pebbles at a tank. I fired once into its back, aiming for what I hoped would be a vital area. The bullet struck home with a wet thud, but the thing barely flinched, as if being shot was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. My hands shook as I realized that everything I'd been trained to rely on, every tool and technique that had made me confident in my ability to handle wilderness emergencies, was useless against this nightmare. I fired again, this time aiming for its head, but at the last second it jerked sideways and the bullet went wide. The creature released Daniel and spun around with unnatural fluidity, fixing those terrible small eyes on me. For a moment, we stared at each other across a distance of maybe 6 feet, predator and prey sizing each other up. Then it smiled. I swear to God it smiled, pulling back its lips to reveal more teeth than any earthly creature should possess, all of them stained dark with Daniel's blood. The expression was so human and so wrong that it broke something inside. My mind, some carefully maintained barrier between the rational world I thought I lived in and the chaotic nightmare that was apparently the truth. The creature turned and dashed toward a thick stand of brambles, moving so low to the ground that branches barely rustled as it passed. I tried to follow, emptying the rest of my clip into the underbrush, but it vanished into the deep forest, with the same impossible speed it had shown when attacking. The woods swallowed it completely, leaving no trace except the metallic smell of blood and that lingering stench of wet fur and decay. I knelt beside Daniel, pressing my hands against the wounds on his shoulder and trying not to think about how much blood he was losing. The bite marks were deep and jagged, torn rather than cut, as if the creature's teeth had been designed to cause maximum damage rather than achieve a clean kill. Dark arterial blood seeped between my fingers no matter how much pressure I applied. "Hold on, Dan," I whispered, though I could already see the gray pallor creeping across his face. "Help's coming. Just hold on." He gripped my arm with surprising strength, his eyes wide with a fear that went deeper than physical pain. He kept whispering something I couldn't make out, his voice weak and thready. I leaned closer, trying to catch his words, but they weren't in any language I recognized. They sounded old, primal, like something humans might have spoken when we still huddled in caves and feared the darkness. Daniel's eyes rolled back, showing white, and his grip on my arm loosened. I checked his pulse, pressing my ear to his chest and listening for the sound of breath that never came. Nothing. The man who'd been alive and joking just minutes earlier was gone, leaving only cooling meat for the flies to discover. I sat back, on my heels, tears stinging my eyes and a rage building in my chest that threatened to consume what was left of my sanity. I had known Daniel since I started this job, had shared countless cups of coffee and stupid jokes with him during the slow shifts. He'd been planning to retire in 2 years, had been looking forward to spending more time with his grandchildren. Now he lay still in the dirt, his blood on my hands and in the soil, feeding whatever diseased ecosystem had spawned the thing that killed him. The forest around us had gone completely silent, as if every living thing for miles around was holding its breath and waiting to see what would happen next. Even the flies had stopped buzzing, hanging motionless in the air like they were frozen in time. The silence felt pregnant with malevolent intent, as if the woods themselves were complicit in what had happened. I stood on unsteady legs, scanning the tree line with new eyes. Every shadow could hide a predator. Every rustling branch could signal an attack. The comfortable familiarity I'd felt with these woods was gone forever, replaced by the knowledge that I was an intruder in a place where human rules didn't apply. My radio crackled with static and I realized I should report what had happened. But how do you explain something that shouldn't exist? How do you tell your supervisors that Daniel was killed by a creature that looked like it had crawled out of humanity's worst nightmares? "Base, this is Glenn," I managed, surprised by how hoarse my voice sounded. "We've lost Daniel. The animal is still out here, and it's not like anything in the wildlife manuals." The response came back filled with static and confusion. I could hear multiple voices in the background, urgent conversations that cut off when someone keyed the microphone. They told me to retreat if I could reach a safer area and wait for the rescue team. But their voices carried an undertone that suggested they knew more about what was happening than they were saying over the radio. I felt a hollow sensation in my chest, as if someone had scooped out my insides and left me empty. The world had tilted off its axis, and everything I'd believed about the natural order had been shattered by the reality of what I'd witnessed. I'd always thought my job was relatively safe, that the worst I might encounter would be rattlesnakes or a black bear defending her cubs. Those were natural dangers, things that could be understood and dealt with through training and common sense. This creature was something else entirely, something that existed outside the boundaries of normal predator-prey relationships. It killed not for food or territory, but for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. And it possessed an intelligence that made it far more dangerous than any mere animal. I began moving quickly back toward the main trail, following my own footprints and trying not to think about how exposed I was. Every step felt uncertain, as if the forest floor might give way beneath me and drop me into some subterranean lair where more of these things waited in the darkness. The familiar landmarks I'd known for months now seemed alien and threatening, transformed by my new understanding of what lived in these woods. Twice I paused, thinking I heard that quick scuttling sound behind me, the noise of claws on bark and the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush. But when I turned to look, gun drawn and ready, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. The absence of visible threat was almost worse than seeing the creature would have been, because it meant the thing was smart enough to stay hidden while it stalked me. I reached the old logging road where I'd arranged to meet the rescue team, an overgrown track that had once allowed timber crews to harvest the forest's giants. A broken picnic table sat near the roadside, its wood weathered and scarred by decades of weather and neglect. We'd once used it for orientation tours, pointing out different tree species and explaining forest management techniques to school groups. Now it looked like an altar in some abandoned temple, stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. My radio crackled with updates from the rescue team. They were 20 minutes out, maybe more depending on how badly the recent rains had washed out the logging road. 20 minutes felt like 20 years when you're waiting in a place where something unnatural is hunting human beings. I kept my back to the picnic table and watched the tree line, looking for any sign of movement in the deep shadows between the trunks. The forest seemed to pulse with hidden life, every rustling branch and creaking tree potentially masking the approach of something that wanted me dead. My gun felt pathetically inadequate, a toy weapon against a predator that had shrugged off direct hits from a .40 caliber pistol. The smell lingered in the air, that mixture of wet fur and decay that seemed to be the creature's calling card. It was faint but persistent, carried on air currents that shifted and swirled in patterns that defied the wind direction. Sometimes it seemed to come from the north, sometimes from the south, as if multiple sources were surrounding my position. When I heard the rescue team's truck finally rumbling up the uneven logging road, grinding through mud holes and scraping over fallen branches, I flagged them down with movements that probably looked desperate. The sound of human voices and diesel engines was the most beautiful thing I'd heard all day, a reminder that civilization still existed somewhere beyond the boundaries of this nightmare forest. The team included paramedics, but they were too late for Daniel. His body would have to be retrieved by a separate crew with proper equipment for handling what was now a crime scene. They took my statement, and I tried to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, the look that said they thought shock and trauma were making me see things that weren't there. Soon the area would be flooded with more rangers, wildlife experts, law enforcement officers, and bureaucrats who would try to fit what had happened into neat categories that made sense in their well-ordered world. They would search for rational explanations, look for known predators that might account for the deaths, file reports that reduced human tragedy to statistical data. But I knew they would never find the truth, because the truth was something that couldn't be filed away or explained by existing scientific knowledge. They would find tracks, maybe some fur samples, possibly even photographs or video if they were very lucky, but they would never capture one of these creatures alive, and they would never understand what they were dealing with until it was too late. For now, I leaned against the truck's door and tried not to shake while the medics asked if I was hurt. I told them I wasn't, just rattled, but that was a lie. Something inside me had been broken, some fundamental assumption about the nature of reality that could never be repaired. I was hurt in ways that wouldn't show up on any medical examination. Another ranger, a young guy named Kevin who reminded me of myself before this day, patted my shoulder and handed me a bottle of water. We all stood there looking into the trees, feeling uneasy and uncertain in ways we couldn't articulate. The forest watched us back with patient malevolence, and I could see in Kevin's eyes that he felt it too. That primitive recognition of being in the presence of something that considered us prey. They would search the woods, of course. Teams of experts would comb through every square inch of forest, looking for evidence that would help them understand what had killed Diego and Daniel. They would find tracks that didn't match any known species, hair samples that would confuse laboratory technicians, and bite patterns that would rewrite textbooks about predatory behavior. But they would never find the creatures themselves, because these things had been hiding in the deep places of the world for longer than human civilization had existed. I kept thinking about that smile, the way the creature had pulled back its lips in an expression of pure malevolent intelligence. It wasn't just hungry or territorial. It was something far worse. A predator that understood its prey, that took pleasure in the fear and suffering it caused. The deaths weren't random acts of animal aggression. They were carefully planned executions, carried out by something that had studied human behavior and learned our weaknesses. The ride back to the station passed in a blur of trees and shadows, every mile taking me further from the immediate danger, but closer to the moment when I would have to try to explain the unexplainable. Through the truck's windows, I watched the sunlight flicker through the branches, creating patterns that seemed to move with deliberate intent. Even in the safety of the vehicle, I felt exposed, watched, as if something was tracking our progress and planning its next move. At the station, the atmosphere was thick with tension and whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Word had already spread about Daniel's death, and I could see questions in everyone's eyes that they were afraid to ask. The official story would probably involve a bear attack or a pack of feral dogs, something that could be understood and dealt with through conventional means. But the people who work these woods every day knew better. They had heard the stories, seen the signs, felt the wrongness that permeated certain areas of the forest. I spent the rest of that day answering questions from investigators who took notes with the mechanical precision of people, trying not to think too hard about what they were writing down. They asked about the creature's size, its behavior, any identifying characteristics that might help classify it. I told them everything I could remember, watching their expressions grow more skeptical with each detail that didn't fit into their understanding of how the natural world worked. One investigator, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Sarah Chen, seemed different from the others. She listened to my account with the attention of someone who had encountered mysteries before, and when I described the creature's intelligence, the way it had smiled before disappearing, she nodded as if such behavior wasn't entirely unprecedented. "There have been reports," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Other incidents in remote areas. Things that don't make it into official files because they're too difficult to explain. Witnesses who describe creatures that don't match any known species. Attacks that show signs of intelligence and planning rather than random animal aggression." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What you saw today isn't unique, Glenn. There are things living in the wild places of the world that science hasn't cataloged yet. Things that have learned to avoid human contact except when they choose otherwise. Most of the time they stay hidden, but sometimes something drives them out of their normal territory, or they decide that humans are encroaching too much on their domain." The implications of what she was saying hit me like a physical blow. If these creatures existed in other places, if there had been other incidents, then what had happened to Diego and Daniel wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern, an ongoing conflict between humanity and something that had every reason to consider us invaders in their ancient territory. That night, I lay in my small apartment on the edge of town, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound that filtered through the walls. The familiar creaks and settling noises of the building seemed different now, potentially significant in ways they had never been before. When the wind picked up and branches scraped against my windows, I found myself reaching for the pistol I kept in my nightstand drawer. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams filled with small eyes and too many teeth. Visions of creatures moving through darkness with the fluid grace of natural-born killers. I woke repeatedly, drenched in sweat and certain that something was watching me from the shadows in the corner of my room. Each time I turned on the lights, I found nothing but familiar furniture and the mundane debris of ordinary life. But the feeling of being observed never completely went away. The next morning brought news that made my blood run cold. Another hiker had been reported missing, a woman named Jennifer Walsh who had been camping alone in a different section of the forest. Her abandoned tent had been found by a group of day hikers, But like Diego's gear, it showed signs of violent damage that didn't match any normal animal behavior. The fabric had been shredded in precise patterns, and her sleeping bag was soaked with something dark that wasn't rainwater. I volunteered to join the search team, despite my supervisor's suggestion that I might want to take some time off to recover from what I'd experienced. But I couldn't stay away. Couldn't shake the feeling that I had a responsibility to find Jennifer before she suffered the same fate as Diego and Daniel, if there was even a chance she was still alive. I had to try to help her. The search led us deeper into the forest than I had ever ventured, into areas where the canopy grew so thick that noon felt like twilight, and strange flowers bloomed in colors that seemed to hurt the eyes. The air itself felt different here, thicker and harder to breathe, carrying scents that spoke of decay and ancient secrets. Our radio communication became spotty, filled with static that sometimes sounded almost like voices, whispering in languages that predated human civilization. We found Jennifer's body near a natural clearing where massive stones had been arranged in patterns that definitely weren't random. The placement was too precise, too deliberate, forming geometric shapes that seemed to focus and concentrate the unnatural atmosphere that permeated this part of the forest. Jennifer lay in the center of the stone circle, positioned with the same ritualistic care that had characterized Diego's death. But this time, we weren't alone when we made the discovery. They emerged from the forest around us with the coordinated precision of a military unit. More of the creatures than I had dared to imagine might exist. At least 6 of them, possibly more hidden in the deeper shadows, moving with that same fluid grace that defied natural physics. They didn't attack immediately, instead surrounding our search team in a perfect circle and watching us with those small, intelligent eyes. The lead creature, larger than the others and bearing scars that spoke of countless battles, stepped forward into the clearing. Its movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, and when it opened its mouth to speak, the sound that emerged was like nothing I had ever heard from any living thing. It wasn't quite language, and it wasn't quite animal vocalization, but something between the two that conveyed meaning on a level deeper than conscious thought. The words, if they could be called words, seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly to the most primitive parts of my brain. The message was simple and terrifying in its clarity. This is our place. You are trespassing. Leave now, or join the others who thought they could walk here freely. For a moment that felt like hours, we stared at each other across the clearing, human and inhuman, separated by an evolutionary gulf that had somehow been bridged by mutual recognition of intelligence. Then one of the younger rangers, a kid named Tyler who had never encountered anything worse than a lost Boy Scout, raised his rifle with shaking hands. The lead creature tilted its head, an almost human gesture of curiosity, and smiled that same terrible smile I had seen before. In that expression was a challenge, an invitation to try our luck against predators that had been perfecting their hunting techniques for millennia before humans invented fire. Tyler fired a single shot that went wide, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the trunk of an ancient oak. The creature's smile widened, revealing more teeth than should have been able to fit in any mouth, and it began to move forward with the unhurried confidence of something that knew exactly how this encounter would end. I grabbed Tyler's arm and pulled him backward, shouting for the entire team to retreat. We ran through the forest with the desperate speed of prey animals, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs while behind us the creatures followed at their own pace. They could have caught us easily, could have picked us off one by one as we stumbled through their territory, but they chose not to, content to herd us toward the forest's edge like wolves driving sheep. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, where our vehicles waited like metallic lifelines connecting us to the civilized world. Only when we were safely inside, doors locked and engines running, did we allow ourselves to believe we might survive the day. But even then, I could see the creatures watching us from the tree line, patient and confident, waiting for the next group of humans foolish enough to wander into their domain. The official reports would classify Jennifer's death as another animal attack, probably by the same pack of feral dogs or rogue bear that had supposedly killed Diego and Daniel. The stone circle would be attributed to Native American religious practices, and the damaged campsite would be explained away as normal predator behavior. Within a month, the area would be reopened to hikers with nothing more than a few additional warning signs about wildlife safety. But I knew the truth, and that knowledge changed everything about how I saw the world. The wilderness wasn't empty space waiting to be conquered by human expansion. It was occupied territory, home to things that had been here long before our species learned to walk upright, and they were growing tired of our intrusions into their ancient domain. I left the Park Service 6 months later, unable to continue working in a place where I knew every trail might lead to an encounter with something that wanted me dead. But the creatures followed me even into retirement, visiting my dreams with those patient, intelligent eyes and that smile that promised eventual reckoning. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my new home in the suburbs, I think I catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows, a shape that moves too fluidly to be human, too purposefully to be a normal animal. And I remember the message that had been conveyed without words in that forest clearing. We know where you are. We remember your scent. And when the time comes, when we decide that humanity has pushed too far into places that were never meant for you, we will come for all of you. Until that day, I wait and watch and try not to think about the smell of wet fur and the sound of claws on bark. But I know that someday, when the last wild places have been paved over and the last forests have been clear-cut, these creatures will emerge from whatever deep holes they've been hiding in and remind us that we were never really the apex predators we thought ourselves to be. The Cherokee National Forest still stands, still draws hikers and campers who believe they're visiting an empty wilderness. The warning signs are still posted, still routinely ignored by people who think human technology and intelligence have made us immune to natural selection. And in the deepest parts of those woods, where the trees grow thick enough to block out the sun and strange flowers bloom in impossible colors, ancient predators wait with patient hunger for the next group of humans foolish enough to believe they belong in places that were never meant for them. I carry their scent with me still, that mixture of wet fur and decay that mark their territory and their victims. Sometimes I smell it on the wind, carried from forests hundreds of miles away, and I know that what I encountered wasn't unique to Tennessee. These creatures exist wherever humans haven't completely conquered the wild, hiding in plain sight and waiting for their chance to remind us that we are not, and have never been alone on this planet. The hunt continues, and we are still the prey. Something thrashed in the dark under the overlook. Steel cables snapped, and I scrambled after the falling child, my headlamp bouncing wild circles while screams ricocheted across the gorge, telling me this routine patrol had twisted into nightmare territory tonight. My name is Elias Hart, and this happened back in 2012 in Tallulah Gorge State Park, Georgia. The shift began with the simple task of clearing the North Rim Trail before sunset. March weekdays tended to be quiet, and I relished these moments when the tourist chatter died away and the ancient gorge could breathe. The limestone walls seemed to exhale something older than memory, something that predated the Cherokee who once called this place sacred. I liked the hush that settled once the last tourists drove off, their SUVs and minivans disappearing down the winding access road like retreating insects. By 5:30, the gatehouse was locked, the visitor center lights dimmed to amber emergency strips, and the gorge shimmered below like a surgical slit in the earth's flesh. The canyon walls dropped nearly 1,000 feet, carved by millennia of water and wind into something that resembled the ribcage of some primordial beast. Standing at the overlook, you could feel the weight of all that stone pressing down, the accumulated darkness of centuries pooling in the depths where sunlight never fully reached. I carried the standard gear, radio crackling with static that sometimes picked up voices speaking languages that didn't exist, trauma kit with supplies that seemed inadequate against the gorge's sharp teeth, a 40 cal sidearm I prayed I'd never need, and a fresh thermos of lukewarm diner coffee that tasted like burnt disappointment. My boots echoed hollow on the wooden walkways, each footstep announcing my presence to whatever dwelled in the shadows between the rocks. The North Rim Trail wound through stands of mountain laurel and rhododendron, their leaves rustling with whispers I told myself were just wind. But there's a difference between natural sounds and the other kind, the sounds that make your spine crawl and your peripheral vision twitch. As I walked, I noticed things that hadn't been there on my morning rounds. Scratch marks on tree bark too high for bears, too deep for wildcats. Stones arranged in patterns that might have been coincidence but felt deliberate, like markers left by something that understood geometry in ways human minds weren't meant to grasp. The trail descended through switchbacks that grew narrower with each turn, until the path became little more than a goat track carved into the cliff face. Here the rock showed its age in layers of sediment compressed into stone, each stratum a chapter in Earth's violent history. Fossils peeked from the limestone like dead eyes, Ancient sea creatures that had died when this place was ocean floor, before continents shifted and mountains thrust skyward. Before I could finish the standard security loop, dispatch crackled through the radio speaker. The voice of James, the night dispatcher, carried an edge I'd never heard before. Unit 7, we've got a missing party report. Father and 2 children. Last seen at Hurricane Falls staircase approximately 30 minutes ago. I keyed the radio, my thumb finding the worn button by muscle memory. Unit 7 responding. Ages on the children? Father reports a boy, age 7, and a girl, age 6. Names are... Static swallowed the rest, but names didn't matter now. What mattered was that darkness was falling fast, and the gorge had already begun its nightly transformation from tourist attraction to something far more primitive and hungry. I picked up my pace, jogging where the trail allowed, scrambling over loose shale where it didn't. The beam of my headlamp carved a tunnel through the gathering gloom, but beyond its reach, the darkness pressed in with almost physical weight. My radio crackled again, James's voice more strained. Unit 7, be advised, we're getting reports of structural failure on the zipline system. Possible cable snap. Air sat heavy against the granite walls, thick with moisture that seemed to carry more than just humidity. There was a metallic taste to it, like blood mixed with copper pennies, and underneath that, something organic and wrong. The smell of things that should stay buried. Then I heard it, screaming metal, the tortured shriek of steel cables parting under impossible strain. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, multiplying and distorting until it became a chorus of mechanical agony. Following close behind came a man's panicked shouts, raw with terror and desperation. I found him halfway down the Hurricane Falls staircase, his knuckles white against the safety rail, eyes reflecting my headlamp beam like a trapped animal's. The stairs descended into the gorge in a series of metal grates and platforms, each section bolted into the living rock. But one of the zipline anchor points had torn free, leaving a ragged wound in the stone where the mounting bolts had been ripped out by forces that should have been impossible. My son fell, he rasped, voice hoarse from screaming. The cable snapped. He's down there somewhere. His finger shook as he pointed toward the canyon wall, where the remains of a zipline support dangled like a broken spider web. 30 feet below the platform, a child's safety harness flicked in the breeze like a hanged man's noose. Empty. I radioed for EMS, but even as I spoke the words, I knew we were beyond standard rescue protocol. The boy should have been dead, should have been nothing but broken bones on the rocks below. But there was no body, no blood, no sign of impact, just that empty harness swaying in the growing darkness. I clipped a rappel line to the rail and dropped fast, my boots scraping against the limestone face as I descended. Each foot of rope that played through my hands took me deeper into a world where normal rules didn't apply, where gravity and physics bent to accommodate horrors that had no right to exist. My helmet smacked against a ledge, sending stars across my vision, but I kept descending. The rock face was scarred with crevices and overhangs, perfect hiding places for things that preferred the dark. And there, pressed into a narrow shelf barely wide enough for a child's feet, I saw them, shoe prints in the red Georgia clay, small and desperate, leading along a goat path that shouldn't exist. The path had been carved into the rock face with deliberate precision, each foothold shaped by tools I couldn't identify. The edges were too smooth for natural erosion, too purposeful for accident. Someone or something had spent considerable time creating this route, and recent use had worn the stones to a dark polish that gleamed like old blood in my headlamp's beam. A small handprint stained with clay pressed into a flat slab of granite told me the boy had passed this way. But the print was wrong somehow. The fingers were too long, the thumb positioned at an impossible angle. Either terror had contorted the child's hand into an unnatural shape, or something else had left this mark, something that wanted me to follow. The father's terrified wails faded behind me as I followed the impossible path deeper into the gorge's anatomy. Each step took me further from the world of safety rails and emergency protocols, into a realm where the only law was survival, and the only judge was whatever ancient thing had made its home in these depths. The path veered sharply to the right, disappearing into what looked like a natural cave mouth carved from solid limestone. But as I approached, details emerged that made my skin crawl. The opening was too regular, too deliberately shaped. The edges had been smoothed and polished until they resembled the inside of a throat. complete with ridges and grooves that suggested peristaltic movement, as if this passage were designed to swallow and digest whatever entered. I ducked inside, my headlamp beam revealing walls that wept with moisture. The air tasted of rust and something worse, something organic that made my stomach clench with revulsion. Iron seepage was common in limestone caves, but this was different. This stung the nostrils like fresh battery acid mixed with the sweet corruption of meat left too long in the sun. 20 yards in, beneath a ceiling of jagged shale that hung like broken teeth, I found the boy. His safety helmet had cracked against the rocks, the impact spiderwebbing the plastic in patterns that reminded me of broken skulls. The tiny LED emergency beacon blinked weakly beside his sneakers, its fading light casting intermittent shadows that made the cave walls seem to pulse and breathe. He stared at me but didn't speak. Couldn't speak. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words in a language I didn't recognize, syllables that hurt to hear even in silence. His eyes had gone completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, as if something had flooded them from within. Tears of dark fluid tracked down his cheeks, but he seemed unaware of their presence. At first I thought he'd wedged himself under collapsed rock, a common injury in unstable cave systems. Children often panicked and squeezed into spaces that offered the illusion of safety, but as I knelt beside him, the rock began to breathe. What I had mistaken for limestone was flesh, pale as sun-bleached bone, and mottled with veins that pulsed with sluggish circulation. The surface was rough as sandpaper, covered in tiny scales that shifted and moved independently. The mass stretched across the cave floor and up the walls, a living carpet that undulated with slow, hypnotic rhythm. Bony ridges taller than my thigh protruded from the flesh at regular intervals, each one crowned with clusters of organs I couldn't identify. Some resembled eyes but were too large and too numerous, blinking in sequence like a biological countdown. Others looked like mouths, lipless and lined with rows of needle-sharp projections that clicked together in rhythmic patterns, as if the thing were tasting the air and finding it satisfactory. The boy's torso was pinned beneath what I now realized was a forearm, though calling it that seemed inadequate. The limb was segmented like an arthropod's leg, each joint protected by plates of natural armor that gleamed with secreted mucus. Rows of folded appendages ran along its length, part finger, part claw, part something else entirely. They twitched and flexed with independent life, each one ending in a hook of translucent chitin, sharp enough to split stone. The creature had positioned itself with deliberate care, its bulk arranged to block every possible escape route while maintaining perfect access to its prey. One of its hooks had penetrated the fabric of the boy's shirt and entered the skin beneath, but no blood flowed from the wound. Instead, the puncture had sealed around the intrusion, flesh melding with chitin in an obscene marriage of tissue and tool. The thing concentrated on the child with the focused intensity of a connoisseur savoring a fine wine, its entire body oriented toward him, every sensor and organ tuned to his presence. I could see the boy's body heat being absorbed through the points of contact, his skin growing pale and cold as his life force was slowly, methodically drained. A ridge of hairless quills ran along the creature's spine, each one as thick as my thumb and twice as long. They twitched like antennae, constantly sampling the cave's atmosphere and adjusting their position to track movement and sound. When I shifted my weight, every quill snapped toward me with mechanical precision, their tips weeping clear fluid that hissed when it hit the stone floor. I drew my pistol, the familiar weight of steel and polymer, offering little comfort in this alien environment. The cave ceiling was too low for a proper shooting stance, forcing me to crouch awkwardly while trying to find an angle that wouldn't put the boy in my line of fire. My hands shook, not from fear but from the wrongness of this place. The way reality seemed to bend and blur around the creature's presence. "Let him go," I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls and returning as a distorted echo that sounded like laughter. The creature didn't respond to human speech, but the sound caused its quills to bristle, and its breathing to quicken. Whatever intelligence it possessed was older and more fundamental than language, operating on principles that predated human civilization. I stepped closer, my boots splashing through puddles of fluid that I tried not to identify. The creature's attention remained fixed on the boy, but I could sense its awareness of my presence, could feel its assessment of me as either threat or opportunity. One of its lesser limbs, a tendril barely thicker than my wrist, began to snake toward my ankle with predatory patience. I fired a single round into the creature's flank, aiming for what I hoped was a vital organ. The impact sounded like hitting wet plywood, a dull slap that spoke of density and resilience far beyond normal flesh. The bullet disappeared into the creature's mass without apparent effect, absorbed like a pebble dropped into thick mud. But the shot triggered a reaction. The limb holding the boy recoiled violently, the entire cave structure shaking as the creature registered pain and surprise. Its breathing became rapid and shallow, almost panting, and the air filled with a groan deeper than thunder, deeper than the quarry blasts I'd heard echoing through mountain valleys. The boy slipped free as the creature's grip loosened, its attention finally divided between prey and threat. I grabbed his collar, hauling him behind me as I backed toward the cave entrance. His skin was ice cold to the touch and his weight seemed wrong, as if something essential had been drained from him during his captivity. The creature began to rise, revealing its true scope for the first time. What I had taken for the entire organism was merely its feeding apparatus, the visible portion of something much larger and more complex. The bulk of its body remained buried in the cave floor, integrated with the living rock in ways that suggested it had been growing here for years, perhaps decades. An elongated skull emerged from the flesh, completely eyeless but covered in sensory organs that made vision redundant. The nostrils were slits that ran the full length of the head, opening and closing in complex patterns as it analyzed our scent, our fear, our biological signatures. Its mouth was a triangular hinge lined with rows of blunt gripping plates instead of traditional teeth, designed not to tear flesh but to hold prey immobile while slower, more thorough consumption took place. The creature didn't charge so much as flow, its body segments rippling in waves that defied normal locomotion. Dozens of claws clicked against the rock floor in a percussion of hunger and malice, each footfall precisely calculated to maintain balance while navigating the uneven terrain. I fired again, twice in rapid succession, aiming for the head where I hoped to find some vital structure. The rounds drilled neat holes in the skull's surface, but even as I watched, the wounds began to close. The flesh flowed like liquid, reforming around the damage as if the bullets had never existed. Whatever this thing was, conventional weapons were barely an inconvenience. The gunshots woke something else in the cave. Hundreds of bats that had never seen daylight shrieked overhead, their sonar calls creating a cacophony that made coherent thought nearly impossible. They had been roosting in the ceiling, hanging from projections that I now realized weren't natural rock formations but calcified remains of the creature's previous meals. Bones wrapped in stone, preserved like insects in amber. The bats' wings brushed my face and the boys as they fled toward an exit we couldn't see, their panic adding to the chaos as the creature advanced. Their echolocation revealed the cave's true dimensions, painting a sonic picture of passages and chambers that extended far beyond my headlamp's range. This place was vast, an underground complex that had been carved over geological timescales. I shoved the boy toward the entrance, clipping him to my rappel line with trembling hands. "Slide down to your dad quick as you can," I told him, though I wasn't sure he could understand. His black eyes stared through me as if I were transparent, as if he were seeing things that existed in spectrums beyond human perception. He didn't argue, couldn't argue. His body moved with mechanical obedience, sliding down the rope with a coordination that seemed impossible for a traumatized 7-year-old. Something had changed him during his time in the creature's embrace, altered him in ways that might not become apparent for years. I took position at the cave mouth, daylight streaming past me in golden shafts that the creature seemed to avoid. The contrast was stark enough to hurt, the normal world of sunshine and safety existing mere feet from this pocket of primordial nightmare. A rappel line still hung from the Hurricane Falls staircase above, my lifeline back to reality. I was about to clip into my escape route when a second scream rose from the depths of the gorge, higher in pitch and unmistakably female. The sound carried notes of terror so pure they seemed to crystallize in the air, sharp enough to cut. This was the missing daughter, and her cry echoed from a side gorge near Tempesta Falls, half a mile downstream over terrain that challenged even experienced climbers. The father was still sobbing above, his voice raw from calling his children's names into the uncaring stone. When I shouted up to him that his boy was safe, he collapsed against the staircase railings with relief that was almost palpable. But then I had to deliver the harder news. "Your daughter is still missing. I can hear her, but she's deeper in the gorge system." "How long has she been gone?" 20 minutes, maybe more," he called back, his words broken by exhaustion and fear. She was right behind us on the trail, and then she just wasn't. Like she'd been erased. That was the nature of this place. The Tallulah Gorge didn't just hide things. It consumed them, pulled them into its depths through methods that couldn't be mapped or predicted. Tourist disappearances were rare but not unheard of, though most were attributed to falls or exposure rather than the truth that park management wasn't equipped to handle. I couldn't leave the girl to whatever had taken her brother, couldn't live with the knowledge that I'd chosen the easier rescue over the necessary one. I told dispatch through my crackling radio that the boy was safe with his father, but the daughter remained unaccounted for. The estimated time of arrival for backup was 40 minutes, which might as well have been forever when measured against a child's terror. I shoved fresh magazines into my belt, knowing that bullets had proved useless against one creature, but hoping desperately that whatever held the girl might be more conventionally vulnerable. The weight of extra ammunition was comforting, even if its effectiveness remained questionable. The run to Tempesta Falls took me through sections of the gorge that existed on no official map, places where the rock had been carved by forces other than water and time. Trail markers vanished after 2 switchbacks, leaving me to navigate by instinct in the fading echoes of the girl's screams. I skidded down slopes of loose scree that shifted treacherously underfoot, grabbing at rhododendron branches for balance when the gradient became too steep for controlled descent. The thorns tore at my uniform and skin, leaving tiny wounds that stung like paper cuts but provided crucial grip when everything else threatened to give way. The gorge narrowed as I descended, its walls closing in until the sky became little more than a ribbon of stars overhead. Water churned 10 feet below the path, white foam visible in my headlamp beam as the Tallulah River fought its way through channels that had been carved when the world was younger. A red hair ribbon snagged on a branch ahead, its bright color incongruous among the muted grays and browns of the stone. The fabric was new, probably purchased at one of the gift shops that sold overpriced souvenirs to families who had no idea what they were really visiting. Now it served as a marker, a breadcrumb trail leading into places where commerce and civilization held no meaning. Then I smelled it again. That same metallic stench from the first cave, but stronger now, concentrated to the point where it made my eyes water. The gorge walls were sweating the odor from every pore, seeping it through cracks and fissures that went deeper than any natural formation should extend. Moss that had grown on these rocks for decades was curling brown and dying where the scent touched it, botanical death spreading in slow waves. At a sharp bend in the gorge, the stream poured through a limestone arch that formed a half-submerged tunnel. The water moved with unusual speed here, as if eager to escape whatever lay beyond the natural bridge. Pink light flickered inside the tunnel, not the steady glow of emergency lighting, but something organic, something that pulsed with the rhythm of a massive heart. I slipped off my boots and slung them over my shoulder, knowing that stealth might be more valuable than protection in what lay ahead. The water was shockingly cold, mountain runoff that had never been touched by sunlight, and it numbed my feet within seconds. But the cold was clean, a sharp contrast to the corruption that emanated from deeper in the tunnel system. My foot struck something soft in the stream bed, and I fished it up with growing dread. A child's fanny pack, purple nylon decorated with a cartoon unicorn that grinned with innocent happiness. The zipper was broken, torn open from the inside as if something had clawed its way out, and dark stains marked the fabric in patterns that looked disturbingly like handprints. The limestone arch funneled water and unwary prey into a chamber wide as a railroad boxcar, its ceiling lost in shadows that my headlamp couldn't penetrate. But it was the lighting that stopped me cold. String lights hung from invisible anchor points above, the kind of LED decorations that tourists use to make their campsites more festive. Their power packs lay scattered and broken on the chamber floor. Internal components spilled like electronic organs. But somehow the lights continued to function. The illumination they provided was wrong. Too pink, too organic. It pulsed in rhythm with something I couldn't see, casting shifting shadows that made the chamber's dimensions seem to change moment by moment. In that unsteady light I saw her. The daughter sat in the far corner, hugging her knees to her chest in a posture that spoke of absolute terror, held in check only by complete exhaustion. Her lips had gone blue with cold or shock, and her breathing came in shallow gasps that misted in the chamber's chill air. But she was alive, conscious, aware of my presence even if she couldn't acknowledge it. The thing that loomed over her was different from the first creature but related, like variations on a theme of nightmare. This one stood upright on legs that splayed like a spider's, but the proportions were wrong. Too long in some places, too thick in others. Its torso pulsed visibly at a wound in its side, dark fluid seeping from a hole that matched the size of a .40 caliber bullet. The creatures were connected somehow, part of a larger organism or colony that shared information through methods beyond human understanding. My attack on the first had wounded them all, or perhaps there had never been multiple creatures at all, just different manifestations of something vast and distributed throughout the gorge's hidden spaces. This manifestation had been designed for different prey, adapted for the psychological predation that worked best on young children. Where the first creature had relied on physical restraint and biological vampirism, this one employed subtler methods. It didn't need to touch the girl to feed on her. Her terror was nourishment enough, seasoned with the gradual erosion of hope and sanity. The girl's sobs came weak and intermittent, as if the monster had been leeching not just warmth, but sound itself, stealing her voice along with her strength. Her eyes tracked my movement with desperate hope, but when she tried to speak, only barely audible whispers emerged. I measured the distance between us, 15 yards of uneven rock floor, water up to my shins, surfaces polished smooth by centuries of flow. One shot wouldn't be enough. Might not even slow this thing down if it was as resilient as its companion. I needed leverage, height, some advantage that might let me get between the creature and its prey. Across the chamber, a broken steel ladder led to what looked like a maintenance access hatch, probably part of some long-abandoned infrastructure project. The rungs appeared sturdy enough to support my weight, and the elevated position would give me the tactical advantage I desperately needed. A plan formed in my mind, crude but workable. Climb high, drop from above, draw the creature away from the girl, give her a clear path to the tunnel entrance. It wasn't elegant, but elegance was a luxury I couldn't afford with a child's life hanging in the balance. I holstered my pistol and crept sideways along the chamber wall, using every piece of cover the irregular stone provided. The creature's attention remained focused on its prey, savoring the slow dissolution of her resistance. This was a predator that enjoyed the process as much as the result, drawing out the experience until fear became a tangible substance it could consume. I stepped onto the ladder's bottom rung, and the sound rang through the chamber like a bell tolling midnight. The noise was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, amplified and distorted by the stone walls until it became a cacophony that hurt to hear. The creature's elongated head snapped toward me with mechanical precision, nostril slits flaring wide as it sampled my scent. Its back half pivoted separately from the front, the entire torso rotating on an axis that defied vertebrate anatomy. The movement was smooth and predatory, like a gun turret tracking a target, and it revealed the creature's true nature as something that had never been bound by the limitations of terrestrial evolution. It rushed across the pool, not running but flowing, its limbs moving in coordination that seemed choreographed rather than instinctual. Water barely rippled around its feet, as if it weighed nothing or displaced its mass through methods that physics couldn't explain. The approach was silent except for the soft clicking of claws against stone, a percussion section for the symphony of terror it conducted. I climbed 3 rungs in rapid succession, swung myself onto a narrow ledge that jutted from the chamber wall, and yanked a road flare from my equipment vest. The ignition striker sparked on the first try, filling the chamber with brilliant scarlet light that revealed details I wished I couldn't see. The creature's skin was more complex than I'd initially realized, composed of layers that shifted and moved independently. Beneath the pale outer surface, darker structures pulsed with their own rhythm, organs or vessels that served functions I didn't want to contemplate. Each segment of its body was covered in fine cilia that waved in the air currents, sampling chemical traces and atmospheric pressure with sensitivity that made human senses seem crude by comparison. The flare's light caused an immediate reaction. The thing shrieked, a sound that started in registers too low for human hearing and climbed through octaves of pain until it became a physical force that made my teeth ache. Its quills stood erect along its spine, each tip now weeping clear fluid that hissed and sparked where it contacted the stone floor. Whatever that secretion was, it reacted violently with the chamber's limestone, eating tiny craters in rock that had stood unchanged for millennia. The creature was literally dissolving its environment, reshaping the space to better suit its needs and preferences. It thrashed from side to side, temporarily blinded by the flare's intensity but not substantially harmed. The light seemed to interfere with its sensory apparatus rather than cause physical damage, like shining a spotlight into night vision goggles. But the disruption gave me the opening I needed. I vaulted down from my perch, landing directly in front of the creature with the flare held high like a torch. The heat radiating from the chemical fire was intense enough to sear my palm through the protective grip, but I held steady, thrusting the brilliant flame toward the creature's featureless face. "Run past me," I shouted to the girl, my voice barely audible over the creature's continued shrieking. "Follow the water back to daylight." She scrambled to her feet with surprising agility, slipping on the wet stone but maintaining her balance through pure determination. Her path took her within inches of the creature's thrashing limbs, but its attention remained fixed on the flare and the pain it represented. She cleared its reach and disappeared into the tunnel entrance, her splash-splash footfalls echoing back as she fled toward safety. With the girl clear, I could focus entirely on survival. I drew my pistol with my free hand, aimed for the joint where the creature's upper and lower torso sections connected, and emptied the magazine in rapid fire. The enclosed space turned the gunshots into thunder. Each report multiplied and reflected until the sound became a physical assault on my eardrums. Flesh tore under the barrage, dark fluid spraying in patterns that painted the chamber walls with biological graffiti. The smell of copper pennies mixed with something worse, something that reminded me of vegetables left too long in summer heat. The creature's middle section sagged as crucial structural elements were damaged, but it continued to advance with mechanical determination. The slide locked back on an empty chamber. I ejected the spent magazine, fumbling for a spare with hands made clumsy by adrenaline and the awkward grip of the flare. The tactical reload that had been drilled into me during training became a nightmare of dropped ammunition and sweating palms. Before I could seat the fresh magazine, the creature struck back. The floor tilted as it slapped one of its primary limbs beneath my feet, the impact traveling through stone and boot sole to rattle my entire skeleton. I fell hard, my pistol skittering away across the slick surface to disappear into shadows beyond the flare's reach. In that moment of vulnerability, as I lay stunned and disarmed on the chamber floor, I saw the creature's underside for the first time. What I observed there will haunt me until the day I die. Translucent membranes stretched between the bony ridges of its spine, creating windows into an internal anatomy that violated every principle of biology I thought I understood. Dark veins pulsed with fluid that moved too slowly to be blood, carrying nutrients and waste products through a circulatory system designed by alien logic. But it was what moved within those membranes that made my sanity real. Shapes that might have been larvae spiraled through the fluid, growing and changing as I watched. Some resembled human forms in miniature, others were purely abstract, geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. They were developing, maturing, preparing for some purpose that I prayed I would never witness. The creature was not just a predator. It was a nursery, a living incubator for things that would eventually emerge to hunt in their own right. Every victim it consumed contributed genetic material to the development process, adding human characteristics to offspring that would be better equipped to prey on human victims. The ultimate biological weapon, constantly adapting and evolving to overcome any defense. I pulled my K-bar fighting knife from its sheath, the familiar weight of steel and leather grip providing an anchor of reliability in a situation that had gone completely beyond normal parameters. The blade was sharp enough to shave with, maintained with the obsessive care of someone whose life had sometimes depended on the edge's integrity. I slashed at the junction where membrane met spine, aiming for what looked like a major connection point in the creature's internal architecture. The knife bit deep, parting tissue that felt like wet rubber mixed with cartilage. Warm gel spilled over my hand, coating my skin with fluid that tingled and burned like diluted acid. The creature's reaction was immediate and violent. It recoiled with a vibration that rattled my teeth and made my vision blur, a frequency that seemed designed to disrupt human neural activity. One of its hooked limbs swept toward my neck in a strike that would have decapitated me if it had connected. I ducked, but the hook still clipped my shoulder, popping through flesh like a zipper being opened. The pain was immediate and intense, but adrenaline provided its own anesthesia, flooding my system with chemicals that pushed physical sensation into the background. Blood ran warm down my sleeve, but I remained functional, able to continue the fight despite the injury. The flare guttered as its chemical fuel ran low, the brilliant scarlet light fading to a dull orange glow that barely pushed back the encroaching darkness. In seconds, I would be fighting blind against something that had evolved to hunt in conditions where human senses were useless. I used the dying ember to ignite my second and final flare, jabbing the fresh flame directly into the wound I had opened in the creature's abdomen. Light seared the internal structures, causing them to contract and spasm in ways that spoke of agony beyond human comprehension. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The creature's torso ballooned as internal pressure built beyond the capacity of its structural elements to contain. Muscles convulsed in waves that ran the length of its body, and the carefully maintained equilibrium of its biological systems collapsed into chaos. Then it collapsed inward with a wet, tearing sound that reminded me of a balloon deflating, but much worse. Segments that had been held together by internal pressure separated and drifted apart, still twitching with residual nervous activity. The organized predator became a collection of disconnected parts, each one moving with its own agenda but unable to coordinate with the others. I staggered backward, warm blood flowing down my sleeve and dripping from my fingertips to paint the chamber floor in patterns that looked disturbingly like the creature's own secretions. The parallels weren't lost on me. In this place, the line between predator and prey seemed to blur until the distinction became meaningless. The thing's front section kept moving even after the rest had shut down, dragging its ruined bulk behind it with single-minded determination. Its jaws clacked together in rhythm, still trying to feed even as its circulatory system leaked out onto the stone. Whatever drove these creatures was more fundamental than simple biology, a hunger that transcended death itself. I retrieved my pistol from the shadows, reloaded with deliberate care, and approached the still-moving head section. At point-blank range, I fired repeatedly into the elongated skull until the slide locked open on an empty chamber. Each bullet drilled neat holes in bone and cartilage, but it took the entire magazine before the jaw movements finally ceased. Even then, I wasn't convinced it was truly dead. The quills along its spine continued to twitch like severed power lines, and fluid still seeped from wounds that should have been fatal individually, let alone in combination. This thing operated by rules I didn't understand, and death might be just another state of existence rather than an ending. I keyed my radio with blood-slick fingers, surprised to find that it still functioned despite the submersion and abuse it had endured. My voice came out as a harsh rasp that barely resembled human speech. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Second child recovered and en route to safety. Hostile neutralized, but I need immediate medical evacuation and..." I paused, trying to find words for what couldn't be adequately described. "Specimen containment. Full hazmat protocols." The radio crackled back with James's voice, tight with confusion and concern. "Unit 7, say again. Did you say specimen containment?" "Affirmative. We have biological hazmat situation in the gorge system. Multiple unknown organisms possibly connected. I repeat, this is not a standard wildlife incident." Static filled the channel for long seconds before James responded. "Roger, Unit 7. Medical and hazmat teams en route. Estimated arrival 20 minutes to your last known position." 20 minutes felt like an eternity when standing knee-deep in alien biology that might still pose a threat. I lifted the girl and began the careful process of retracing my path through the flooded tunnel. Her weight seemed wrong against my chest, too light, as if whatever the creature had been doing to her had drained more than just warmth and hope. She didn't speak during the journey, but her eyes remained open and tracking, following movements in shadows that I couldn't see. Occasionally, her lips would move in silent conversation with invisible companions, forming words in that same alien language her brother had attempted. Whatever had happened to these children went deeper than simple trauma. They had been changed on a fundamental level. The tunnel entrance appeared ahead like a portal between worlds, framing a view of normal Georgia evening that seemed impossibly distant and foreign. Stars emerged in the darkening sky above the gorge, their light clean and cold compared to the organic phosphorescence I was leaving behind. Outside, the father waited with his son at the base of Hurricane Falls staircase, both of them wrapped in emergency blankets that park rangers had provided. The boy's transformation was more apparent in better light. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of systemic shock, and his movements carried a mechanical precision that was deeply unsettling in someone so young. When I placed his daughter in the father's arms, the reunion should have been joyful. Instead, Both children regarded their parent with the same black-eyed stare as if they were studying a specimen rather than embracing a loved one. The father seemed unaware of the change, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. "What happened down there?" he asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "What hurt them?" I lied with practiced ease, falling back on explanations that would preserve his sanity and my own credibility.
Cave-in trapped them in an unstable section.
They're suffering from exposure and mild hypothermia, but they should recover with proper medical attention. He seemed to accept this, clinging to an explanation that fit within his understanding of how the world worked. But I caught him glancing at his children with growing unease, sensing the wrongness even if he couldn't articulate it. Some changes couldn't be hidden, even from a parent's desperate need to believe everything was normal. From the ridge above, I spotted the flashing lights of parked police vehicles weaving through the pine forest that surrounded the gorge. Red and blue strobes painted the trees in colors that reminded me uncomfortably of the lighting in the chamber below. Soon this place would be crawling with investigators, medical personnel, and bureaucrats who would want explanations I couldn't provide. The medics arrived first, 2 paramedics named Robert and Michael, who had worked the park beat long enough to handle most emergencies without blinking. But they stopped short when they saw the children, exchanging glances that spoke of professional concern beyond simple hypothermia. "Core temperatures are low but not critical," Robert reported after his initial examination, "but their neurological responses are unusual. Pupils reactive but dilated, reflexes hyperactive in some areas, completely absent in others. We should transport to Atlanta for comprehensive evaluation." My own injury required 14 stitches to close properly, the hooks having torn flesh in parallel lines that looked disturbingly like claw marks. The paramedic cleaning the wounds, a veteran named William, kept glancing at the pattern with increasing puzzlement. "Never seen punctures quite like these," he murmured, dabbing antiseptic into the deepest cuts. "Almost looks like they were made by surgical instruments, but what kind of animal carries tools?" I didn't answer. Couldn't answer without opening doors that needed to stay closed. The hooks had carried no venom that conventional tests could detect, but something had been transferred during the attack. My shoulder throbbed with a deep, persistent ache that felt organic, alive, as if foreign cells were establishing colonies in my tissue. Search and rescue teams wanted immediate access to the chamber where I'd fought the second creature, but wildlife officers argued for preliminary assessment before disturbing what might be a significant biological discovery. The debate raged for hours while my injury was treated and statements were taken, bureaucracy grinding forward with its usual indifference to urgency. By full darkness, they had reached a compromise. A cage the size of a horse stall was lowered into the chamber, designed to contain whatever remained of the creature while preserving it for scientific study. Researchers from the University of Georgia's biology department were already en route, eager to examine what they assumed would be a new species of cave-dwelling predator. But when the containment team reached the chamber, they found something that challenged every assumption about what they were dealing with. What lay inside the limestone cave was barely recognizable as organic matter, reduced to sludge and cartilage that dissolved even as they watched. The organism was breaking down at an accelerated rate, as if its cellular structure required constant interaction with living prey to maintain cohesion. Dr. David Patterson, the lead biologist on the containment team, emerged from the chamber with samples that were already turning to gray paste in their collection containers. His report would later be classified, but I heard enough to understand that conventional science had no framework for what we had encountered. "It's like the tissue is programmed to self-destruct," he told his colleague, Dr. Charles Webb, as they prepared to depart. "Cellular walls breaking down, proteins denaturing. Even the DNA is fragmenting faster than natural decay should allow. Whatever this was, it didn't want to be studied." The night crew packed up their equipment with the efficient movements of people who had dealt with inexplicable situations before. Tallulah Gorge State Park had a history of unusual incidents that were quietly filed away and forgotten. Mysteries that couldn't be solved and therefore couldn't be acknowledged. One rookie ranger, a young man named Timothy, who still believed in standard operating procedures, approached me as I sat on the tailgate of a rescue vehicle. His question was innocent, born of curiosity rather than suspicion. "You think there might be more of them down there?" he asked, glancing nervously toward the gorge. "I mean, if this was some kind of breeding population." I told him what I'd been telling myself since the first encounter, the lie that would let both of us sleep at night. The gorge has been here a long time, and we've only just started turning rocks over. What we found tonight was probably an isolated case, maybe the last of its kind. Timothy laughed, thinking I was making a joke about the completeness of our victory. He had no way of knowing that I'd seen the larvae developing in the creature's transparent nursery chambers, or that the children who'd been exposed carried genetic markers that might not manifest for years. Some stones were better left unturned, some truths too dangerous for general consumption. I watched the last crate being loaded into a refrigerated transport truck, heard the latches click with mechanical finality. The sound should have been reassuring, but it only reminded me of other sounds I'd heard in the depths. Clicking and chittering that spoke of intelligence older than human civilization. The truck pulled away into the Georgia night, carrying samples that would mystify researchers and spawn classified studies that would never see publication. Within a week, the incident would be reduced to a single paragraph in a Park Service report, filed under wildlife encounters with details too vague to reconstruct the truth. But I knew the truth, carried it in the ache of my wounded shoulder, and the memory of alien eyes watching from the darkness. The gorge held secrets that predated human presence in North America, organisms that had been waiting in the deep places for millennia. Patient as stone and hungry as time itself, the children and their father disappeared into the medical system, transported to specialists who would find nothing wrong beyond trauma and exposure. The boy and girl would recover, at least physically, and return to normal lives that would be haunted by dreams they couldn't quite remember. But sometimes, late at night, they would speak in languages that didn't exist, and their eyes would go black as they stared at things that weren't there. As for the gorge itself, it returned to its normal routine of scenic overlooks and guided tours, nature walks and educational programs. Tourists would come and go, most of them unaware that they walked above chambers where nightmare had taken physical form. The zip-line system was repaired and safety tested, new cables installed with redundant anchor points that were certified to hold far more weight than any human payload would require. But sometimes, in the deepest part of the night shift, when the last visitors had gone home and the gorge lay silent under starlight, I would hear things that weren't supposed to exist. Scratching sounds from crevices that went deeper than any survey had measured. Calls that might have been wind through stone formations. If you could convince yourself that wind could carry such intelligence, such hunger. The Park Service rotated me to a different district within 6 months. Standard procedure for rangers who had experienced traumatic incidents. My replacement was a young woman named Sarah, who approached the job with enthusiasm and a master's degree in environmental science. I tried to warn her in ways that wouldn't sound like madness about the need for caution in certain areas of the gorge. Just remember, I told her during the transition briefing, some places have been wild longer than others. Trust your instincts, especially after dark. If something feels wrong, it probably is. She nodded with the polite attention of someone humoring a veteran's superstitions, making notes in her training manual that she would probably ignore within the first week. The young always believed they were smarter than the dangers that had claimed their predecessors, right up until the moment they discovered how wrong they were. I heard about her disappearance 3 years later, during a routine night patrol that she had insisted on conducting alone. Her radio went silent at approximately 2:30 a.m., last transmission reporting strange sounds from the Hurricane Falls area. Search teams found her equipment scattered along the North Rim Trail, but no trace of Sarah herself. The official report blamed equipment failure and accidental fall, death by misadventure in terrain that was inherently dangerous for solo operations. Her body was never recovered, which wasn't unusual given the gorge's depth and the difficulty of searching every crevice and cave system. The case was closed within a month, filed with dozens of others who had simply vanished into the stone. But I knew better. I knew that some hungers couldn't be satisfied by a single feeding, that patience was just another form of predation for things that measured time in geological epochs. The creatures I had encountered were gone, dissolved into component chemicals that would nourish other growths in the deep places. But their legacy remained, written in the genetic structure of organisms that had learned new ways to hunt, new forms to wear when the next opportunity presented itself. The gorge was patient. It had waited millions of years for the right conditions, the right prey, the right moment to reveal what lurked in its depths. It could wait millions more, content in the knowledge that humans would continue to come, continue to explore, continue to push into places where they didn't belong. And when they did, when the next ranger or researcher or curious tourist followed the wrong path into the darkness below, something would be waiting, something that remembered what I had done, what weapons I had used, what weaknesses I had exposed, something that had learned from our encounter and adapted accordingly. The Tallulah Gorge State Park remains open to this day, its scenic beauty attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The suspension bridge sways gently in the mountain air, offering breathtaking views of the falls and the ancient stone that frames them. Families pose for photographs against backdrops of geological wonder, children laughing as they peer into depths that seem to go on forever. And deep below, in chambers that exist on no official survey, in darkness that has never known the touch of sunlight, something stirs with the patience of stone and the hunger of time itself, waiting for the next ranger, the next child, the next opportunity to feed and grow and spread its influence through the world above. The cages we used that night were strong, but they were built for creatures that stayed dead when you killed them. Some things are older than death, more persistent than extinction, more patient than human memory. Some things know that every cage has bars and every bar has spaces between. In the end, we didn't contain the threat. We just taught it to be more careful next time. My name is Caleb Douglas, and this took place in 2017 when I was working as a forest ranger at Ocala National Forest down in Florida, right around the spring season, not long after a heavy rainstorm had left the trails muddy and the underbrush thick with new growth. The rain had been biblical that week, the kind that turns dirt roads into streams and makes the Spanish moss hang like wet funeral shrouds from every branch. The forest breathed differently after storms like that. It exhaled a thick, humid breath that carried the scent of decomposition and rebirth all tangled together. It was late afternoon, maybe 4:30, and I'd just finished eating a ham sandwich that I'd packed that morning. The bread had gotten soggy from the humidity despite being wrapped in foil, and the mustard, spicy brown, the kind my ex-wife never let me buy, had leaked through to make the whole thing a mess. But I was hungry, and after 12 years of ranging these woods, you learn to eat what you bring. I was standing near one of the old trailheads, the one that leads toward the cypress groves, where the water stays dark even in full sunlight and the trees grow so thick their roots create a maze. Beneath the surface, I remember brushing crumbs from my uniform and tasting a bit of that spicy mustard at the corner of my mouth. The day had been quiet in that particular way that makes your skin crawl if you've spent enough time in the woods. Not the peaceful quiet of a lazy afternoon, but the unnatural stillness that comes when even the insects sense something's wrong. 2 hikers had come by earlier asking directions to the Silver Springs Connector Trail, their voices too loud in the oppressive silence. A pair of college kids from Gainesville had stopped around noon, trying to identify some woodpecker they'd heard, their field guide dog-eared and marked with highlighter. Nothing unusual on the surface, but the forest felt like it was holding its breath. The cypress groves had always given me pause. Even in my 12 years working these trails, there was something about the way the light filtered through those ancient trees that made shadows move when they shouldn't. The water between the roots stayed mirror black, reflecting nothing, and on windless days like this one, it was impossible to tell where the trees ended and their reflections began. Local Seminole folklore spoke of spirits that lived in standing water, and after enough years walking these paths, you start to understand why indigenous people developed such stories. I guess that's why I let my guard down that afternoon. Normally, I pride myself on staying sharp. It's what keeps you alive out here when you're dealing with everything from copperheads to meth labs hidden back in the palmetto scrub. I'm known for my quick jokes and easy laugh around the ranger station, but I can read a map in a thunderstorm, track a wounded deer through underbrush, and patch a busted ankle with shoelaces and splinters without blinking. That afternoon, though, I was thinking about heading home early to catch the Rays game on TV. Maybe crack open a cold Yuengling and forget about the strange quiet that had been following me around the forest all week. The storm had left everything different. Familiar trails had new washouts, and the rain had uncovered things that had been buried. Old bottles, rusted cans, and in one spot near Clearwater Lake, what looked like the remains of a campfire that had to be decades old, based on how deep it was buried. But it wasn't just the physical changes. The forest felt wrong, like the rain had washed away more than just topsoil and revealed something that should have stayed hidden. I was too relaxed, standing there picking sandwich debris off my shirt and listening to the unnatural quiet. The radio on my belt hadn't crackled all day, unusual for a spring afternoon when hikers typically needed directions or got turned around on the poorly marked trails. Even the ranger station had been dead quiet since morning. It should have been a warning, that silence. In the Florida woods, quiet usually means something's watching. The air hung thick and still, pregnant with moisture and the sweet, sick smell of things rotting in the heat. Somewhere in the distance, a single crow cawed once and then fell silent, as if it had been warned to keep quiet. I checked my watch, 4:35 p.m. Still plenty of daylight left, but in the cypress groves, darkness came early. The canopy was so thick that even at noon it felt like twilight down there among the roots and standing water. I should have paid attention to the signs. The unusual quiet, the way my skin prickled every time I looked toward the cypress groves, the fact that I hadn't seen a single squirrel or rabbit all day. Even the ever-present buzz of mosquitoes seemed muted, as if they knew something I didn't. But I was thinking about baseball and cold beer, and that distraction almost cost me everything. Sometime around 5 o'clock, when the light had started its slow fade toward evening, a camper named Jody showed up at the ranger station near the main dirt road. She was short, maybe 5'2", and wore a pink bandana that had seen better days, the kind of faded fabric that spoke of too many camping trips and not enough washing machines. Her hiking boots were caked with the dark mud that only came from the deeper parts of the forest, where the cypress roots created perpetual swamps and the ground never fully dried. She seemed out of breath, not just from exertion but from something deeper, a kind of breathlessness that comes from fear trying to disguise itself as concern. Her hands shook slightly as she gestured toward the woods, and when she spoke, her voice had that tight quality of someone trying very hard to stay calm. She told me her boyfriend and another friend had gone fishing earlier, in the day near a hidden spring that locals sometimes used but wasn't marked on any official trail maps. The spring she was talking about had to be the one about 1.5 miles back in the cypress groves, where an underground river surfaced briefly before disappearing again into the limestone. It was a good fishing spot if you could find it. The water stayed cool even in summer, and the base liked the deep pool it created. But it was also isolated, surrounded by thick palmetto and connected to the main trail by what was barely a deer path. Most people never found it unless they had a local guide or stumbled across it by accident. They hadn't returned, and it was getting late. Her boyfriend was experienced, she said, the kind of guy who never got turned around in the woods and always carried a compass. The friend was new to Florida, a transplant from somewhere up north who wasn't used to how quickly the forest could swallow you up. She sounded worried, but not panicked, not yet. There was still that hope in her voice that maybe they'd just lost track of time, maybe caught a big one and decided to stay until sunset. I said I'd help look, the words coming out automatically even as something in my gut started to coil tight. I grabbed my radio and called Tom Jennings, a younger ranger who'd been hired just that winter after the previous guy transferred to the Everglades. Tom was a good kid, about 26, always humming some old pop tune under his breath, usually something from the 80s that he'd picked up from his dad's record collection. He had an easy smile and the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd gotten into this work in the first place. Before 12 years of dealing with lost hikers and illegal hunting had worn down some of my own optimism. Tom knew the trails pretty well for someone so new, better than most rangers picked up in their first year. He had that natural sense of direction that can't be taught, and he'd grown up hunting with his father in the Appalachian foothills, so he understood how forests could turn dangerous without warning. More importantly, he was steady under pressure. I'd seen him talk down a panicked hiker who'd been lost for 6 hours, using that calm voice and easy manner to get the guy to think clearly about where he'd taken wrong turns. I told Jody to wait at the station, maybe make herself some instant coffee from the electric pot we kept plugged in behind the counter. The coffee was terrible, the kind of bitter, burnt-tasting stuff that only tasted good when you'd been walking trails for 8 hours. But it was hot and caffeinated, and she looked like she could use both. She nodded and settled into one of the plastic chairs we kept for visitors, but I could see her eyes kept drifting toward the windows that faced the forest. Then Tom and I started down the path toward the fishing spot. We moved through stands of longleaf pines that had survived the storm better than I'd expected, their thick trunks scarred but standing. The palmetto fronds hung heavy with leftover moisture, and every step through the undergrowth sent up small clouds of insects that had been disturbed from their hiding places. The air was thick enough to drink, heavy with humidity and the green smell of things growing too fast in too much moisture. I remember the muddy ground pulling at my boots with each step, a steady sucking sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the oppressive quiet. The storm had turned the trail into a series of mud holes connected by slightly firmer patches of ground, and more than once I had to grab onto a palmetto frond to keep from losing my balance. Tom moved behind me with the careful steps of someone who'd learned not to trust his footing, testing each step before committing his full weight. After about half a mile, where the main trail curved around a cluster of ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, Tom spotted something hanging over a low branch. It was a jacket, olive green and looked new. The kind of expensive outdoor gear that weekend hikers bought at REI, thinking it would make them experts. The fabric was still damp from the humidity, but it had been hung deliberately, not just snagged on the branch by accident. I remember Tom picking it up, turning it over in his hands with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read signs in the woods. The jacket was well made, probably cost more than I made in a week, but there was something wrong with it. Near the collar, where the fabric met the zipper, there was a dark stain about the size of a silver dollar. The stain had that rusty brown color that meant it had been there for hours, maybe since morning, and when Tom held it up to the fading light, we could both see it wasn't just dirt or tree sap. "Caleb," Tom said, his voice losing some of its usual lightness, "this isn't just dirt." He held the jacket closer and I leaned in to get a better look. The stain had that particular smell, metallic and slightly sweet, that you never forget once you've encountered it. Blood. Definitely blood. And enough of it to soak through the fabric and stay wet in the humid air. I frowned, fighting the urge to jump to conclusions. People cut themselves in the woods all the time, cleaning fish, slipping on wet rocks, tangling with palmetto thorns that could slice you open if you weren't careful. I said maybe the guy had cut himself gutting a fish, the words coming out flat even to my own ears. It was the kind of explanation you offer when you don't want to think about the alternatives, when you're hoping that reasonable explanation still applied. But something in the careful way Tom folded the jacket and the look in his eyes told me he wasn't buying it any more than I was. We'd both seen what fish cleaning accidents looked like, and this was different. This was too much blood in the wrong place, and the way it had dried suggested it had happened quickly, not the slow seepage of a minor cut. We moved on, both a little tense now, our previous casual conversation replaced by a heightened awareness of every sound and shadow. The forest seemed to be watching us, and for the first time in my 12 years as a ranger, I found myself wishing I'd brought more than just a radio and a pocket knife. As we pressed deeper into the forest, following the barely visible path that led toward the hidden spring, the late sunlight began its slow fade toward evening. The trees pressed in closer here, their canopy so thick that even in full daylight this part of the forest felt perpetually shrouded in twilight. The storm had left everything changed. Familiar landmarks were obscured by fallen branches, and new pools of standing water reflected the darkening sky like black mirrors scattered throughout the underbrush. We tried calling out as we walked, our voices echoing strangely in the humid air. "Anyone here? You folks need help." The calls sounded thin and desperate in the oppressive silence, swallowed up by the thick vegetation before they could travel far. No one answered, not even an echo from the limestone formations that usually bounced sound back at you. The quiet was so complete it felt like a physical presence, pressing against our eardrums and making us want to whisper instead of shout. About 20 minutes later, after pushing through a particularly thick patch of palmetto and ducking under low-hanging moss that clung to our uniforms like wet fingers, we found the first body. It was a man, maybe mid-30s, sprawled out near a small clearing where the palmetto leaves had been flattened in a rough circle, as if something large had thrashed around in the undergrowth. The ground around him was dark with moisture, but not the clean dampness of recent rain. This was something thicker, something that made the earth sticky and gave off a smell that made my stomach lurch. His fishing rod lay snapped beside him, the expensive graphite shaft broken in 3 places and the reel mechanism torn apart, as if something had grabbed it with incredible force. The line was tangled in the nearby bushes, and scattered around the body were the contents of a tackle box, bright lures and lead weights that caught what little light filtered through the canopy. But it was the man himself that made Tom whisper, "Jesus, Caleb," and take an involuntary step backward. His torso had deep wounds, Tears in the fabric of his shirt and the flesh beneath that spoke of incredible force and razor-sharp instruments. I won't go into too much detail, even now thinking about it makes my hands shake. But it looked like he'd been attacked by something with powerful jaws and teeth that were designed for more than just catching fish. The wounds were too clean, too deliberately placed, to be from any animal I knew lived in these woods. There was no sign of Jody's boyfriend, which meant he was still out there somewhere, hopefully alive and just lost in the labyrinth of trails that spider-webbed through this part of the forest. Tom put his hand to his mouth, fighting back the urge to be sick, and I put a steadying hand on his shoulder. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples, and my mouth had gone dry despite the humid air. We needed to call this in immediately, but when I tried the radio, all I got was static and the occasional burst of garbled transmission from somewhere far away. The canopy overhead was thick enough to block satellite signals, and the nearest cell tower was 15 miles away across terrain that liked to swallow radio waves. Reception had always been spotty in this part of the forest, but today it seemed like the woods themselves were conspiring to keep us isolated. We agreed to circle the area and look for the other missing camper before heading back to the station to use the landline. Neither of us said it out loud, but I think both of us hoped the second guy was alive, maybe just injured and hiding somewhere in the thick underbrush. It was the kind of hope you cling to when the alternative is too terrible to contemplate, when you need something to keep you moving forward instead of running screaming back towards civilization. As we searched, expanding our circle outward from the body, the silence grew suffocating. Every rustle of leaves made us freeze. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the quiet air. A breeze made the Spanish moss sway overhead, creating shadows that moved and shifted in ways that made your eyes play tricks on you. I found myself jumping at small sounds, a squirrel darting up a trunk, the drip of moisture from overhead branches, the distant splash of something entering one of the dark pools that dotted this area. Tom tried to joke to ease the tension that was winding tighter with each passing minute. "If I find any fish fillets lying around," he said, his voice forced and shaky, "I'm out of here." I gave him what I hoped was a reassuring smile, but it felt more like a grimace. His face had gone pale beneath his tan, and I could see a muscle jumping in his jaw as he clenched and unclenched his teeth. We spotted footprints in the soft mud heading northwest, away from the body and deeper into the swampier part of the forest where the cypress trees grew thick and the water never fully receded. The prints looked frantic, pressed deep into the earth as if someone had been running hard, and they were widely spaced in a way that suggested panic rather than a casual hike. We followed them carefully, reading the story they told in the churned mud, someone fleeing in terror, stumbling, getting back up, running again. The sun dipped lower as we tracked the prints, and the smell in the air grew stronger, not just the usual decay of organic matter in a swamp, but something heavier and more cloying. It was like rotting vegetation mixed with something else I couldn't identify, something that made my sinuses burn and my eyes water. Tom noticed it too. I could see him breathing through his mouth and trying not to gag. After a few minutes of following the desperate trail through increasingly thick underbrush, we found the second camper. He'd made it maybe 100 yards farther than his friend, but it hadn't been enough. He was face down in a shallow ditch filled with dark water that reflected nothing, his body half submerged in the stagnant pool. The back of his jacket, a different style than the one we'd found hanging on the branch, was torn open in long parallel gashes that went straight through the heavy fabric and into the flesh beneath. I felt my throat tighten, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt sideways. I'd seen animal attacks before in my 12 years as a ranger. A bobcat taking down a fawn, a panther dragging off a wild hog, even the aftermath of an alligator encounter down near the river. But this was different. This was a human being, someone who'd gotten up that morning planning to spend a peaceful day fishing, and now he was lying in a stagnant pool with his life leaking out into the dark water. Tom stepped back, his face gone completely white now, and said, "Caleb, we have to get out of here." His voice was tight with barely controlled panic, and I could see his hands shaking as he reached for his radio out of habit, before remembering it was useless out here. I agreed completely. Whatever had done this was still out there somewhere, and we were unarmed except for my pocket knife and whatever makeshift weapons we could find in the forest. We started back toward the main trail, moving faster than we should have, but trying not to make noise that might attract attention from whatever was lurking in the deeper woods. The forest felt different now, alive with malevolent intelligence instead of the benign indifference I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Every branch seemed to scrape at us deliberately, and the air held that foul scent that made breathing feel like swallowing poison. That's when we saw it move between the palmettos, about 30 feet ahead of us where the trail curved around a massive cypress, whose roots created a natural barrier. At first I thought it might be a bear, though bears were rare in this part of Florida and usually avoided human contact. But as it shifted position, I could see this was something else, entirely. Something that didn't belong in any wildlife manual I'd ever studied. The thing that moved between the palmettos was like nothing I'd ever seen in 12 years of ranging these woods. It was low-slung and heavy, built like a predator that had never learned to fear anything else in its environment. It wasn't a bear. I'd seen enough black bears to know their shambling gait and rounded silhouette. This creature's shape was more feline, but its body was too thick, too muscular, and its head was far too large for any cat that was supposed to exist in Florida. The color was difficult to make out in the fading light that filtered through the canopy, but it appeared to be a dark brownish black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The fur looked coarse and matted in places, as if it had been through battles before and carried the scars. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the way its shoulders bunched and shifted as it moved, revealing muscle mass that spoke of incredible power and speed. I couldn't see its eyes clearly, just the impression of intelligence behind a heavy skull that seemed too large for its body. When it turned slightly, testing the air with movements that were both cat-like and something else entirely, I caught sight of fangs that extended well beyond what nature typically provided. They were maybe 3 inches long, almost tusk-like, and they caught what little light was available in a way that made them seem to glow against the darkness of its mouth. I tugged Tom's sleeve and we ducked behind a cluster of saw palmetto, the sharp fronds scratching at our uniforms as we tried to make ourselves invisible. Through the gaps in the vegetation, we watched it move toward where we'd found the first body. Its steps were deliberate and careful, each paw placed with the precision of a hunter that never wasted energy or made unnecessary noise. The way it moved reminded me of videos I'd seen of big cats stalking prey, but there was something more calculated about it, something that suggested intelligence beyond simple animal instinct. The leaves trembled as it approached the spot where the first camper lay, and I realized that the sound wasn't coming from the wind. There was no wind in this part of the forest. The trembling was coming from the creature's own movements, so heavy that each step sent vibrations through the soft ground. When it reached the body, it lowered its massive head and began to investigate, moving with the careful attention of something that understood exactly what it was examining. It seemed to sniff at the corpse, and I caught a glimpse of its profile that made my blood run cold. The skull was elongated, predatory, but there was something wrong with the proportions. The jaw was too heavy, the forehead too pronounced, and when it opened its mouth slightly, I could see rows of teeth that no Florida animal was supposed to possess. This wasn't just a large predator. This was something that evolution had designed specifically for killing. Tom put a hand over his mouth to stifle any sound, and I could feel him trembling beside me. The smart thing to do was to back away slowly, retreat to the main trail, and get help with proper weapons and backup. But as I watched this thing investigate the scene of carnage it had created, I felt a terrible fascination mixed with the fear. This was something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I nudged Tom and whispered as quietly as I could, "We go back now." My voice came out as barely a breath, but in the unnatural silence of the forest it seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Tom nodded frantically, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from finally understanding you're prey instead of predator, that you've stumbled into something's hunting ground and it knows you're there. We tried to ease away from our hiding spot, moving one careful step at a time and testing each footfall before committing our weight. The palmetto fronds caught at our clothes, and every small sound seemed amplified in the oppressive quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and my breathing sounded like a bellows in the still air. Sweat was running down my back, despite the humidity, the cold sweat of pure terror that no amount of experience or training could prevent. But whatever senses this creature possessed were sharper than ours. Its massive head snapped up from its investigation, and even from our position behind the palmettos, I could feel its attention focus on us like a laser. There was no sound, no roar of challenge or warning growl like you might expect from a normal predator, just a sudden, terrible awareness that we were no longer hidden. That something with fangs and claws and muscles designed for killing knew exactly where we were. It began to approach, not charging but stepping closer with the confidence of something that had never encountered effective resistance. I could see its shoulders bunch up as it prepared for whatever came next, and the way it moved suggested this wasn't its first encounter with humans. There was a familiarity to its stalking pattern, as if it had done this before and knew how the hunt usually ended. I glanced down at my boots, then up again, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to turn and run. Movement would trigger its chase instinct, and despite our head start, I had no illusions about outrunning something built like this creature. Tom mouthed, "What do we do?" And I realized I didn't have an answer. This wasn't covered in any ranger training manual. Wasn't something you learned about in wildlife management courses. We backed away slowly, each step a careful negotiation with gravity and balance and the treacherous ground beneath our feet. The creature matched our pace, staying the same distance away but never taking its attention off us. It was like some terrible dance, a ritual that it had performed before with other unfortunate souls who'd wandered into its territory. For a few agonizing minutes, I thought we might make it back to the main trail without triggering an attack. We kept backing toward what I hoped was the path we'd followed in, trying to remember landmarks in a forest that all looked the same when you were focused on not dying. Tom even managed a shaky laugh when we hit what felt like more solid ground, as if we'd somehow managed to escape the immediate danger. That was when we heard the heavy thud of something large hitting the ground behind us. Looking back over my shoulder, I saw it break from the thicker brush and move on to what passed for a trail in this part of the forest. It was closer now, maybe 20 feet away, and in the better light I could see details that made my legs weak. Its hide was indeed mangy in places, scarred from battles with other predators or perhaps other members of its own species. The scars along its flank were old but deep, white lines against the dark fur that spoke of claws or teeth that had found their mark. Despite the damage, or perhaps because of it, the creature radiated an aura of absolute lethality, something that had fought and won so many times that conflict was simply another tool in its arsenal. It stood on 4 legs, but the shoulders were far too broad for any Florida animal I could identify. When it bared its teeth slightly, I could see that the tusks were just the beginning. Behind them were rows of smaller, sharper teeth designed for gripping and tearing. But what terrified me most was the silence. No growl, no roar, no sound of warning or challenge. Just heavy, ragged breathing that spoke of excitement or anticipation. We walked backward, I told Tom quietly. Keep it in sight. It was the only strategy I could think of. Don't turn your back on a predator. Don't trigger its chase reflex and hope you could reach help before it decided to end the standoff. Tom looked at me like I was insane, but he nodded. We had maybe a mile to cover to reach the ranger station, and every step would be a negotiation with death. We took a step backward. The creature took a step forward. Another step, another response. My heart felt like a drum in my ears, so loud I was sure the creature could hear it. The distance between us remained constant, but I could see it calculating, weighing options, deciding when the game would end. We had perhaps a quarter-mile covered when I realized we'd never make it to safety this way. On 3 we run, I said quietly, knowing it was probably a death sentence but seeing no other option. Okay? Tom looked at me with the expression of someone who knew he was about to die but was willing to try anyway. He nodded and I started the count. 1, 2. On 2, before I could finish the count, it charged. The creature covered the ground between us so fast that my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. One moment it was 20 feet away, muscles coiled and calculating. The next it was a blur of dark fur and gleaming fangs moving with the speed and inevitability of an avalanche. I barely had time to shout a warning before the world exploded into chaos and terror. Tom turned and ran down the trail with the desperate speed of someone who finally understood that every second counted, and I followed, but before I got more than a few steps, the creature's momentum knocked me sideways like I'd been hit by a freight train. I stumbled into a palmetto bush, the sharp fronds slicing through my uniform shirt and scraping bloody lines across my arms. Pain flared as thorns embedded themselves in my skin, but the adrenaline flooding my system made it feel distant and unimportant. I scrambled to regain my footing, spitting out blood from where I'd bitten my tongue during the impact, and looked up to see the creature barreling after Tom with single-minded determination. Tom's panicked scream echoed through the forest, a sound of pure terror that seemed to hang in the humid air long after the man who made it was gone. I grabbed a fallen branch, something substantial enough to use as a weapon, and yelled, "Hey!" at the top of my lungs, hoping to distract it from its pursuit. It ignored me completely, focused entirely on the running figure ahead. There was something methodical about its pursuit, as if it had done this many times before and knew exactly how the hunt would end. Tom's screams grew more desperate, then suddenly cut off in a way that made my stomach drop and my hands start shaking. I scrambled after them, pushing branches aside and stumbling over roots, following the sounds of thrashing and struggle deeper into the forest. When I reached them, Tom was on the ground in a small clearing about 50 yards off the main trail. His chest was torn open in deep parallel gashes that went through his uniform shirt and the flesh beneath, and his eyes had already gone glassy with the look of someone who was no longer present in their body. The creature had dragged him a few feet from where he'd fallen, leaving a trail of dark stains in the soft earth. I froze, my legs suddenly feeling like water, unable to process what I was seeing. This was Tom Jennings, the kid who hummed 80s songs while walking the trails, who'd been excited about his first real job after college, who'd talked about maybe proposing to his girlfriend when he'd saved up enough money for a decent ring. Now he was lying in the Florida mud with his life leaking out into the indifferent earth. My whole mind screamed at me to do something, to fight, to at least try to help, but I had no rifle, no proper weapon beyond my radio and pocket knife. The branch I'd grabbed felt pathetically inadequate against something that could tear through human flesh like tissue paper. As I watched, paralyzed by terror and indecision, the creature lowered its massive head to Tom's body and began to feed. I'm not proud to admit it, but I backed away. Every instinct I'd developed over 12 years in the woods told me to retreat, to survive, to live, to warn others about what was lurking in these forests. The rational part of my brain knew that staying would only add my body to the count, that dying heroically wouldn't bring Tom back or help anyone else. But the human part of me, the part that had liked Tom and enjoyed his easy humor, felt like a coward for leaving him there. I took slow steps backward, holding my breath and trying not to make any sound that might attract the creature's attention. My boots sank into the muddy ground with that same sucking sound I'd noticed earlier, but now it seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Each step took tremendous effort, fighting against every impulse to turn and run screaming back toward civilization. The creature seemed too busy with its meal to notice me leaving, making wet sounds that I tried desperately not to identify. I walked backward until I couldn't see the clearing anymore, until the Spanish moss and palmetto fronds blocked my view of the horror taking place behind them. Only then did I turn and run, crashing through branches that slapped my face and left welts, stumbling over roots and splashing through shallow pools of stagnant water. Sweat stung my eyes and mixed with the blood from the palmetto scratches on my arms. My lungs burned in the humid air and my heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. I ran until my legs gave out, then got up and ran some more, driven by the image burned into my retinas of Tom lying torn and broken in that clearing. I ran until I broke into the open area around the ranger station, where electric lights seemed impossibly bright after the forest twilight. Jody stood there by the station door, still holding her coffee mug but now staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. She saw my face, saw the blood on my sleeves and the tears in my uniform, and I watched her expression change from concern to horror as she began to understand that her worst fears were about to be confirmed. "Did you?" she began, but her voice trailed off as she took in my appearance. I shook my head, unable to find words that could explain what I'd witnessed. Instead, I stumbled toward the station and reached for the radio inside, my hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the controls. It was nearly dark when the first backup arrived. Another ranger from the district office and a sheriff's deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but my words came out halting and confused. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist? How do you explain that there's a creature in the forest that kills with intelligence and purpose? Something that's not in any field guide or wildlife manual. The deputy looked skeptical when I described the attack, the way the creature moved, the size of its fangs. He said it might have been a panther, though Florida panthers were rare and typically avoided human contact. I didn't argue. What was the point? I knew what I'd seen, and I also knew how it sounded to someone who hadn't been there. They formed a small search party with flashlights and a shotgun, standard procedure for recovering bodies in dangerous terrain. They went out into the darkness while I waited at the station with Jody, who sat crying quietly at the small wooden table where we usually did paperwork. I picked at the splintered edge of the bench and tried not to imagine what was happening out there in the forest. Tried not to picture Tom's body or wonder if the creature was still feeding. They never found Tom's body, only the spot where the struggle had taken place. The searchers returned around midnight, their faces grim and their flashlight beams shaky from exhaustion. The deputy, a middle-aged man named Kenneth who'd worked these woods for 15 years, pulled me aside and spoke in the low, careful tones of someone delivering terrible news. "We found blood," he said, "and signs of a struggle. Torn fabric, disturbed earth, but no body." He paused, studying my face in the harsh light from the station's fluorescent bulbs. Whatever happened out there, it dragged him off. Could be a panther, could be something else. But there's tracks leading deeper into the swamp, toward areas we can't reach safely at night. The creature was gone, vanished into the labyrinth of cypress groves and standing water that made up the heart of Ocala National Forest. The two campers were recovered the next morning by a larger search team, their bodies photographed and documented before being turned over to the county coroner. Officially, their deaths were chalked up to an unknown animal attack, filed away as just another freak occurrence in a state where nature still held dominion over vast stretches of wilderness. But I knew better. I'd seen the intelligence in those movements, the calculated way it had hunted and killed. This wasn't random predation. This was something that understood humans, something that had learned our patterns and weaknesses. The way it had ignored my shouts and focused on Tom, the methodical way it had approached its victims, suggested experience and planning that went far beyond animal instinct. Nature being cruel, they said. Sometimes it happens. Case closed. Jody never got the full story. How could I tell her that her boyfriend had been torn apart by something that shouldn't exist, something that might still be out there hunting? Instead, I sat with her in the fluorescent glare of the station while she filled out forms and answered questions from investigators who were already preparing to file this away as an unfortunate encounter with Florida wildlife. Sometimes I think about that thing's face, though. I'm not sure I ever really saw its face clearly, in the dim light filtering through the canopy. What I remember most is the shape of it in the dusk, the way it moved without hesitation or uncertainty, as if it had never encountered anything in these woods that could challenge it. The way its shoulders bunched with barely contained power, the deliberate placement of each massive paw, the terrible silence that surrounded it like an aura of death. I stayed on as a ranger for another month, but everything had changed. Each time I heard rustling in the undergrowth, I reached for something solid, a stick, my radio, anything that might serve as a weapon against something that laughed at human tools. The forest that had been my workplace and sometimes my sanctuary for 12 years now felt like enemy territory. Every shadow potentially hiding something with fangs and an appetite for human flesh. The deputy told me they'd keep looking, and I nodded politely, but I knew they wouldn't find anything useful. Whatever that creature was, it had claimed Tom's body as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him. The deeper swamps of Ocala National Forest stretched for miles, full of places where a body could disappear forever among the cypress roots and black water. I started coming to work with my nerves wound tight, jumping at every unexpected sound and making awkward jokes about nothing, just to fill the silence that seemed to follow me everywhere. My easy laugh became forced, my confidence shaken in ways that 12 years of experience couldn't repair. The other rangers noticed. I could see it in their concerned glances and the way conversations stopped when I entered a room. Eventually, I quit and moved 2 counties over. Took a desk job with the Parks Administration in Tallahassee, where the closest I came to wild animals were the squirrels that raided the bird feeders outside my office window. I told people I wanted a change of pace, that I was ready for the administrative side of conservation work. Nobody questioned it. Ranger burnout was common enough, and everyone understood that wilderness work could wear you down after enough years. But on warm evenings, when the humidity rises and the air takes on that thick, breathable quality that characterizes Florida summers, I can still smell the muddy leaves and taste the spicy mustard from that ham sandwich I ate on what should have been an ordinary spring afternoon. I can picture Tom's easy grin as he hummed some half-remembered song from his father's record collection. Can remember the way he'd gotten excited about identifying bird calls and tracking deer through the underbrush. Most of all, I remember that shape moving between the palmettos with predatory grace, and I know that just because we never saw it again doesn't mean it left. Creatures like that don't abandon territory that provides everything they need: isolated hunting grounds, dense cover, and a steady supply of prey naive enough to venture into the deep woods without understanding what might be waiting for them. The official reports list Tom Jennings as missing, presumed dead due to animal attack. His girlfriend eventually stopped calling the sheriff's office asking for updates. The case file gathered dust in some cabinet in the county courthouse, just another statistic in Florida's long history of people who walked into the wilderness and never walked back out. But I know the truth. There's something in the Ocala National Forest that doesn't belong in any textbook or field guide. Something that kills with intelligence and purpose and then melts back into the swamps like it was never there at all. It could still be out there, just as quiet, just as patient, waiting for the next group of hikers or fishermen to venture too far from the marked trails. I won't go back to find out. I've traded my ranger uniform for business casual and my hiking boots for dress shoes, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night with the taste of fear in my mouth and the sound of Tom's final scream echoing in my ears. On those nights, I lie in bed listening to the ordinary sounds of suburban life: air conditioners humming, cars passing on distant highways, the comforting noise of civilization, and remind myself that I'm safe now, far from the cypress groves and the standing water where something waits in the shadows. But safety, I've learned, is just another word for distance, and distance means nothing to something that can cover ground like that creature could. Something that might have learned that humans make easy prey if you know how to hunt them properly. The forest that nearly killed me stretches across thousands of acres, full of trails and camping spots and fishing holes where people go to escape the pressures of modern life. They have no idea what might be watching them from the tree line, calculating the distance, waiting for the right moment to prove that humans aren't the apex predators we like to believe we are.
In the deep woods of Florida, in the places where cell phones don't work and help is hours away, something else sits at the top of the food chain, and it's still hungry.
The radio crackled to life at 5:47 a.m., jolting me from the thin sleep I'd managed in my ranger station bunk. Static filled the small cabin before Bennett's voice cut through, tense and unfamiliar. "Base, this is Patrol 7. We've got something out here at Walker Lake. You need to send someone up." I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and reached for the handset. 3 years working the Kaibab National Forest, and I'd never heard Bennett sound like that. The man was steady as granite, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything from bear maulings to lost hikers turned desperate. "This is Base. What's your situation, Bennett?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd lost contact. Then, "It's the livestock. All of Vincent's cattle. Christ, I don't know how to describe this. I was already pulling on my boots. Vincent Yazzie ran a small ranch on the border of the Apache reservation, grazing his cattle on federal land under permit. Good man, kept to himself mostly, but never caused trouble. On my way, 20 minutes. The drive through the pre-dawn darkness gave me time to think, though I tried not to. Growing up in Sedona, I'd heard the stories. Whispers passed between families with roots in the Four Corners country. Tales that made even skeptical park rangers check their locks twice. My grandmother had been half Navajo, and while she'd never spoken directly about such things, I remembered the way she'd go quiet when certain topics arose. The way she'd insist we burn sage after particularly dark dreams. I found Bennett's patrol vehicle parked at the access road to Vincent's grazing land. He was standing next to it, smoking with shaking hands, the first time I'd ever seen him with a cigarette. "Took you long enough," he said, but there was no heat in it, just exhaustion. "Show me." We walked up the dirt track together, flashlights cutting through the morning gloom. The air felt wrong somehow, too still, too quiet. Even the insects had gone silent. Vincent called the sheriff's department around 4. Bennett explained as we walked. Dispatch figured it was our jurisdiction since it happened on federal land. Sheriff Damien asked us to take the initial report. Animal attack? Bennett stopped walking. That's what I thought. That's what I hoped. The smell hit us first, metallic and rotten, mixed with something else I couldn't identify, something that made my nose burn and my stomach turn. Then we crested the small rise, and I saw what had shaken Bennett so badly. 17 head of cattle lay scattered across the meadow in what might have been a pattern, though my mind refused to process the geometry of it. They hadn't simply been killed, they'd been arranged. Each animal had been opened with surgical precision, organs removed and placed in neat piles beside the carcasses. The ground around them was dark with blood But there were no tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication that these animals had fought for their lives. Jesus Christ, I whispered. Gets worse, Bennett said. He led me to the nearest carcass, a young bull that had been Vincent's pride. Look at the cuts. I knelt beside the animal, forcing myself to examine the wounds. The incisions were impossibly clean, made with something sharper than any knife I'd ever seen. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the fact that every cut began and ended in exactly the same place on each animal, following an identical pattern that seemed to have been burned into my memory from childhood nightmares I couldn't quite recall. Have you called this in yet? I asked, waiting for you. Figured you'd want to see it first before the feds come stomping through here. I stood and dusted off my knees, trying to think clearly. Protocol demanded I contact the FBI's livestock crime unit, but something deeper, some instinct I'd inherited from my grandmother's side of the family, told me that involving outsiders would only make things worse. Let's talk to Vincent first. Get his story. We found Vincent Yazzie sitting on his porch, staring out at nothing. He was a big man, mid-50s, with calloused hands and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. But now he looked small, diminished, like something had been drained out of him. Vincent, I called out as we approached. I'm sorry about your cattle. He looked up at us with eyes that seemed much older than they had the last time I'd seen him. You boys shouldn't be out here. We need to ask you some questions, Bennett said. For the report. Vincent shook his head slowly. Won't do any good. This isn't something you can put in a report. I sat down on the porch steps, trying to seem non-threatening. Why don't you tell us what you saw? Wasn't what I saw, Vincent said quietly. Was what I heard. Around midnight, the cattle started making noise. Not scared noise, wrong noise. Like they were calling to something. He paused, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. I went out to check on them. Had my rifle flashlight dog. Normal things. But when I got to the fence line, everything went quiet. Dead quiet, even Silas. He gestured to a German shepherd lying motionless on the porch. For a horrible moment, I thought the dog was dead, until I saw its sides moving in rapid, shallow breaths. What happened to your dog? Found him like that this morning. Won't wake up, but he's breathing. Vet won't come out here. Vincent took a long drag of his cigarette. Had to call you boys because insurance requires a police report. But we both know what this is. Bennett shifted uncomfortably. Vincent, if you have information about who might have done this, not who, Vincent interrupted. What, and you know it too, don't you? He was looking directly at me now. You got the look. Your grandmother was Marie Begay, wasn't she? From over by Monument Valley? I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How did you know my grandmother? She came out here once, maybe 15 years ago. Talked to my father about things. Old things. Said her granddaughter might need to know about them someday. Vincent stood up, stubbed out his cigarette. You should go talk to Harrison Begay. He's her nephew, still lives on the reservation. He'll tell you what you need to know. Vincent, I said carefully, are you saying you think this was done by... But he was already walking back into his house. Don't say the word, he called over his shoulder. Not out here. Not in daylight. And don't come back after sunset. The door closed behind him with a finality that made my skin crawl. Bennett and I drove back to the ranger station in silence. What do you say when you've just seen something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world? How do you write a report that captures the wrongness of those cattle, the surgical precision of their mutilation, the complete absence of any rational explanation? Back at the station, I poured coffee and stared at the blank incident report. Bennett had gone home to his family, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that this was just the beginning. I thought about my grandmother, about the stories she'd never quite told me, about the way she'd always insisted I wear the small turquoise pendant she'd given me when I turned 18. I was wearing it now, had never taken it off, though I'd never been sure why. The phone rang, making me jump. Kaibab Ranger Station. This is Sheriff Damien. I hear you boys had an interesting morning. That's one way to put it. I'm sending Deputy Chase out to take statements. This is going to be a joint investigation. Us, you folks, maybe the FBI if things get weird. I almost laughed. If things got weird, Sheriff, I think we might want to handle this locally for now. Keep it quiet while we investigate. Why's that? I looked out the window at the forest, at the shadows between the trees that seemed deeper than they should be in full daylight. Because I don't think this was done by anyone the FBI is equipped to handle. After I hung up, I sat alone in the station as afternoon faded to evening, writing and rewriting the same report, trying to find words that captured what we'd seen without sounding insane. Outside, the forest grew dark, and for the first time since I'd taken this job, I found myself checking the locks on the doors, somewhere in the distance. I could swear I heard cattle calling, but there were no cattle within 20 miles of the ranger station. The sound came again, closer now, and I realized it wasn't cattle at all. It was something pretending to be cattle. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the forest, and there were many, sent my hand reaching for the service pistol I kept in the nightstand drawer. When dawn finally broke, I was already dressed and making coffee, grateful to have survived until morning. The official reports would wait. I needed answers, and Vincent had pointed me toward the only person who might have them. The drive to the Navajo Nation took 2 hours through country that grew increasingly desolate with each mile. Red rock mesas rose like monuments to ancient gods, while scrub brush and juniper trees dotted the landscape between them. This was old land, the kind that held memories in its bones. I'd called ahead to the tribal headquarters in Window Rock, explained that I needed to speak with Harrison Begay about a livestock incident. The woman who answered, Nevi, according to her nameplate when I arrived, looked at me with curious eyes. Harrison doesn't usually talk to outsiders about incidents, she said carefully. But he said he'd see you. Something about your grandmother. She gave me directions to Harrison's home, a modest house set back from the main road with a view of Shiprock in the distance. The monolith dominated the horizon, its volcanic spire reaching toward clouds that seemed permanently gathered around its peak. Harrison Begay was waiting on his porch when I arrived. He was older than I'd expected, maybe 70, with silver hair pulled back in a traditional style and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. But his eyes were sharp, alert, and when he looked at me, I felt like he was seeing straight through to my bones. "You're Marie's grandson," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. She passed 5 years ago. I know. She came to me in dreams, told me you'd be coming." He gestured to a chair beside him. "Sit. We have much to discuss." I settled into the wooden chair, trying to organize my thoughts. "Mr. Begay, I'm investigating some cattle killings near Walker Lake. Vincent Yazzie suggested I speak with you." Vincent is a good man. He knows when to ask for help. Harrison lit a pipe, the sweet scent of tobacco mixing with sage smoke that seemed to drift from somewhere nearby. "Tell me what you saw." I described the scene at Vincent's ranch, the surgical precision of the wounds, the arrangement of the bodies, the absence of tracks or signs of struggle. Harrison listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grave. "And what did you feel?" he asked when I finished. "Feel? Your grandmother gave you something, protection. What did it tell you?" Almost unconsciously, my hand moved to the turquoise pendant at my throat. The moment I touched it, I felt a warmth that I realized had been missing since yesterday morning. It felt wrong, like the whole place was wrong. Harrison nodded. "Your grandmother was wise. She knew this day would come. Mr. Begay, I need to understand what we're dealing with." Vincent seemed to think. I paused, struggling with words that felt dangerous to speak aloud. "You can't say it," Harrison observed. "Good, that shows respect. But you need to understand, or more people will die." He stood and walked to the edge of his porch, looking out at the vast landscape. "There are things in this world that your people have forgotten, things that never forgot your people. Is that what killed Vincent's cattle? That was just the beginning, let's call it a test, to see how much attention it would draw, how much your people would believe." Harrison turned back to me. "Your grandmother asked me to teach you if this day came. Are you ready to learn?" I thought about the wrongness I'd felt at the ranch, about the sounds I'd heard outside my window last night. "Yes." Harrison disappeared into his house and returned with a leather satchel. From it, he withdrew several items: a small bag of what looked like ground herbs, a piece of carved bone, and a photograph that made my blood freeze. It was my grandmother as a young woman, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. They were both holding rifles and looking down at something on the ground, something that might have been human except for the way its limbs bent, the way its face seemed to shift even in the still photograph. "This was taken in 1952, Harrison said, near what you now call Skinwalker Ranch. Your grandmother was part of a group that dealt with problems, when the traditional ways weren't enough anymore." "Skinwalker Ranch?" The name sent a chill through me. I've heard of it. Some kind of paranormal research facility? Now it is. Back then it was just a place where the barriers were thin, where things could cross over that shouldn't. Harrison put the photograph away. But that's not the only place. There are thin spots all through this country. 9 Mile Valley, Blind Frog Ranch, parts of Utah Territory where the old maps warned travelers not to go. He handed me the bag of herbs. Mix this with tobacco. Burn it if you sense danger. It won't stop one of them, but it will mask your scent, make you harder to track. One of them? Harrison's eyes went hard. Yinald-Lushi skinwalkers. Witches who traded their humanity for power. They can take any form, but they prefer predators. Wolves, bears, coyotes. Sometimes birds of prey. They hunt in packs and they're drawn to fear and violence. But the cattle were just food, or a message, or both. Harrison handed me the carved bone. This is older than the reservation, older than your government, older than the Spanish. It will burn if one of them is near. Keep it with you always. I took the bone, surprised by its warmth. Mr. Biguet, why are they active now? Vincent said this was the first time anything like this had happened in his area. Because someone called them. Harrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Someone with knowledge, someone who knew the old ways. The question is why. We spent the rest of the morning discussing what Harrison called practical matters. How to recognize sign. How to protect myself and others. How to know when I was dealing with something beyond my capabilities. As the sun reached its zenith, he walked me back to my truck. One more thing, he said as I climbed behind the wheel. They can mimic voices perfectly. If someone calls to you from the darkness, don't answer. Don't go looking. And if your radio starts picking up voices you don't recognize, turn it off immediately. The drive back to the ranger station felt longer than it had coming out. Every shadow seemed deeper, every bird call more ominous. The carved bone in my pocket grew warm twice during the journey, and both times I found myself scanning the landscape for movement that shouldn't be there. I was still 20 miles from the station when my radio crackled to life. Base, this is Elena. We have a situation at the campground. Elena Rodriguez was our newest ranger. Fresh out of training and eager to prove herself, she'd been assigned to patrol the developed areas while I handled the backcountry. What's the situation, Elena? Missing camper. Family of 4 checked in yesterday, the Austins. Tyler Austin called this morning to report his father went for a walk last night and never came back. I felt the bone in my pocket grow noticeably warmer. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Have you searched the immediate area? That's the thing. We found tracks leading away from their campsite, but they just stop. Like he vanished into thin air. Or like something had carried him away. Elena, I want you to stay with the family. Don't let anyone else go looking. That's an order. Copy that. But there's something else. The tracks we found, they're not quite right. Like the feet were too big, or the stride was wrong, or... The radio went silent. I called Elena's name twice before a different voice came through the speaker. Male, unfamiliar, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but that made every instinct I'd inherited from my grandmother scream in alarm. I turned off the radio and pressed harder on the accelerator. The campground was in chaos when I arrived. Elena had followed orders and kept the Austin family together, but other campers had heard about the missing man and were demanding answers. I could see the fear in their faces, the way they kept glancing at the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. What's the situation? I asked Elena quietly. Justin Austin, age 42, went for a walk around 10 p.m. last night. His wife Caroline says he was upset about something, kept staring off into the woods during dinner. She thought he just needed air. And the tracks? Elena led me away from the main group to a spot behind the Austin family's tent. The ground here was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding impressions. At first glance, they looked like normal boot prints, size 10 or 11 with a distinctive tread pattern. But the more I looked, the more wrong they seemed. The stride was too long for a normal human gait. The impressions were deeper than they should be, as if whatever made them weighed significantly more than a middle-aged accountant from Phoenix. And there was something else, something that made my grandmother's pendant grow cold against my chest. Elena, I want everyone out of here, now. What? Clear the campground. Tell them we have a gas leak, bear activity, anything. Just get them packed and gone within the hour. Sir, with respect, isn't that an overreaction? One missing hiker. The scream that split the afternoon air cut her off mid-sentence. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, human enough to be recognizable but wrong in every other way. Too long, too high, too full of agony to have come from any throat that still belonged to something entirely human. Elena's face went white. Was that? Move, everyone out now. As Elena organized the evacuation, I followed the tracks deeper into the forest. They led away from the campground in a straight line, as if whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. The carved bone in my pocket grew warmer with each step, and the familiar sense of pine and earth began to mix with something else, something that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. The tracks ended at a clearing I'd never seen before, though I'd been patrolling this area for 3 years. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. The ground inside the circle was dark, stained with something that definitely wasn't mud, but there was no sign of Justin Austin. Instead, there was something else, something that made me back away slowly, my hand moving to the service pistol at my hip. Hanging from the lowest branch of an ancient oak tree was what looked like a cocoon, roughly human-sized, wrapped in what might have been spider silk if any spider grew large enough to produce that much. The cocoon was moving. I was reaching for my radio when I heard Elena's voice calling my name from somewhere behind me. But Elena was supposed to be back at the campground evacuating campers, and the voice was coming from 3 different directions at once. I didn't answer the voices calling my name. Harrison's warning echoed in my memory as I backed away from the clearing, keeping my eyes on the writhing cocoon while straining to listen for actual movement in the underbrush. The voices continued, Elena's voice, Bennett's voice. Even what sounded like my own grandmother calling to me in Navajo words I remembered from childhood. The carved bone was hot enough now to burn through the fabric of my pocket. Whatever was out there, it was close. I made it back to the campground to find Elena supervising the last of the evacuating campers. The Austin family was loading their SUV. Caroline Austin's face streaked with tears while their 2 children, Maya and Kingston, maybe 8 and 10 years old, looked around with the bewildered fear that children show when adults can't explain what's happening. "Did you find anything?" Elena asked as I approached. I studied her face carefully, looking for some sign that this wasn't really Elena. The eyes were right. The voice was right, but Harrison had warned me about their ability to mimic.
How long have I been gone?
"Maybe 20 minutes. You said to evacuate everyone, so that's what I did." She paused, reading something in my expression. "Sir, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Elena, I need you to do something for me. I need you to tell me about the first day we met. The exact conversation we had." Her brow furrowed. "That's kind of a weird request. It was 3 months ago, at the district briefing in Flagstaff. You asked me why I wanted to be a park ranger, and I told you about my grandfather who worked for the Forest Service. You said I had good instincts but needed to learn when to trust them. It was exactly what I remembered. Either this was really Elena, or whatever was out there had access to memories that should have been impossible to obtain. "There's something I need to tell you," I said, "but not here. Follow me back to the main station." During the drive, I tried to organize my thoughts. How do you explain to a rational person that they're dealing with something that exists outside the bounds of rational reality? How do you prepare someone for the possibility that everything they see and hear might be a lie designed to draw them into the darkness? At the station, I made coffee and told Elena to sit down. Then, as carefully as I could, I explained what Harrison had taught me. I showed her the carved bone, the herbs, the pendant my grandmother had given me. I described what I'd found in the forest, the stone circle, the cocoon, the voices that had tried to lure me deeper into the woods. Elena listened without interruption, her expression shifting from skepticism to concern, to something approaching belief. "So you're telling me," she said when I finished, "that we're dealing with some kind of, Native American werewolves?" "Not werewolves. Something worse. Something that chose to become what it is." Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the forest as darkness began to gather between the trees. "Assuming I believe this, which I'm not sure I do, what's our next move? We can't evacuate the entire forest." Before I could answer, the radio crackled to life. This time it was Sheriff Damien's voice, tight with barely controlled panic. "All units, we have a code red situation. Multiple missing persons reported in the Sedona area. Last known locations all within 10 miles of federal forest land." I grabbed the handset. Sheriff, this is the Kaibab station. How many missing? 12 so far. Hikers, campers, couple of locals who went out hunting. All disappeared in the last 48 hours. Static filled the line for a moment. There's something else. We found remains at several of the last known locations. What kind of remains? The kind that make experienced deputies call in sick. I exchanged a look with Elena. Sheriff, I think we need to coordinate our response. This might be connected to the livestock killings. Agreed. I'm setting up a command post at the Sedona substation. Can you meet me there in 2 hours? On our way. Elena and I gathered emergency supplies, extra ammunition, first aid kits, flashlights, batteries. I also packed the herbs Harrison had given me and made sure my grandmother's pendant was secure around my neck. One question, Elena said as we loaded the truck. If these things are as dangerous as you say, why are we heading toward them instead of calling for federal backup? Because federal agents don't carry carved bone and sage. Because they'll go in with helicopters and night vision and tactical teams, and all they'll accomplish is getting more people killed. I started the engine, and because I'm starting to think this isn't random, someone called them here. Someone with a purpose. The drive to Sedona took us through country that grew increasingly ominous as full darkness settled over the landscape. We passed several roadblocks, state police turning back civilian traffic, keeping people away from areas that had become hunting grounds. The Sedona substation was a hive of activity when we arrived. Sheriff Damien had indeed set up a command post with maps spread across tables and deputies manning radios, but I could see the strain in their faces, the way their eyes kept darting to the windows. Glad you could make it, Sheriff Damien said when he saw us. He was a big man, mid-50s, with the kind of mustache that belonged in an old Western movie, but now he looked haggard, like he'd aged 5 years in the last 2 days. What's the situation? He led us to the main map table. Red pins marked last known locations of the missing persons, while black pins marked where remains had been found. The pattern was disturbing. A rough circle with Sedona at its center, gradually contracting as if something was drawing a noose tighter around the town. Started day before yesterday, Sheriff Damien explained. Couple of hikers didn't return from Cathedral Rock. We found their camp this morning, tents torn open from the inside like something had burst out of them. But no bodies, and the remains you mentioned? Deputy Chase, a young man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, spoke up. We found pieces at Bell Rock, Airport Mesa, Chapel of the Holy Cross. Always arranged in patterns. Always surgical cuts, he swallowed hard. And always at places that are supposed to be spiritual vortexes. Elena frowned. Vortexes? Sedona thing, I explained. Certain locations where people claim to feel spiritual energy. New Age tourists come from all over the world to meditate at them. Which might explain the pattern, Sheriff Damien said grimly. If something was feeding on, let's call it psychic energy, those would be the places to hunt. A chill ran down my spine. Sheriff, have you had any contact with the missing persons? Radio calls, cell phone calls, anything? That's the strangest part. Several families have reported getting calls from their missing relatives. But the calls don't make sense. Voices that sound right but say wrong things, asking family members to come out and join them in the wilderness. The carved bone in my pocket was warm, but not burning. Whatever was out there wasn't close, not yet. But it was definitely present. I think we need to assume this is going to get worse before it gets better, I said. How many people do we have? 12 deputies plus you Forest Service folks. State police have another 8 units in the area, but they're staying on the highways. Sheriff Damien rubbed his eyes. Problem is, we don't know what we're hunting. Every report is different. Some people see wolves, others see bears. A few swear they saw people walking on all fours. One guy claims he saw his dead brother beckoning him from across a canyon. They're all probably right, I said quietly. Before anyone could ask what I meant, the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a few seconds later, bathing the station in red light that made everyone's face look like something from a horror movie. Outside, we could hear generators starting up across the town, the background hum of civilization reasserting itself. But in the brief moment of darkness, I'd heard something else. Voices calling from the desert, human voices speaking in perfect English, calling out the names of everyone in the room. Deputy Zachary was moving toward the door. Did you hear that? Someone's calling for help out there. Don't, I said sharply. Nobody goes outside. Nobody responds to voices in the dark. But if someone needs help, It's not someone, Elena said, and I was glad to hear the certainty in her voice. It's something that wants us to think it's someone. Sheriff Damien looked between us with growing understanding. You boys know something about what's out there? I nodded. And if we're going to survive the night, you're going to have to trust us. That's when Deputy George burst through the back door, his face white with terror and his uniform torn. They got Nicholas, he gasped. They got him right off the patrol car. But the thing is, he looked around at all of us with wild eyes. Nicholas is still out there. I can hear him talking on the radio. But I watched something drag him into the desert 5 minutes ago. As if summoned by his words, Nicholas's voice came through the radio speakers, calm and professional. All units, this is Deputy Barrett. I'm pursuing suspects on foot toward Cathedral Rock, requesting backup. We all stared at the radio. Nicholas Barrett had been dead for 3 years, killed in a car accident on Highway 17. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of footsteps circling the building, too many footsteps, moving in perfect synchronization like a pack of predators testing the strength of their prey's defenses. The hunt had found us. The footsteps circled the building 3 times before stopping. In the silence that followed, we could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from multiple directions. Sheriff Damien motioned for everyone to stay quiet while he moved to the window and peered through a gap in the blinds. How many do you see? I whispered. That's the problem. I don't see anything, but I can hear at least 6 of them out there. The radio crackled again, and this time it was Deputy Chase's voice, except Chase was standing right next to me, staring at the radio with growing horror. Sheriff, this is Chase. I'm at Airport Mesa with the missing hikers. They're all fine, just lost. Can you send some units to pick them up? The real Chase started toward the radio, but I grabbed his arm. Don't answer. But if the hikers are, they're not fine. They're dead, and that's not really you on the radio. Sheriff Damien backed away from the window. Motion sensors around the perimeter just lit up. We've got movement on all sides. I pulled the bag of herbs from my pack and began sprinkling them around the room's entry points. The scent of sage and something else, something older and more powerful, filled the air. Several of the deputies wrinkled their noses, but I noticed the oppressive feeling that had been building since nightfall seemed to ease slightly. What's that supposed to do? Elena asked. Mask our scent, make it harder for them to track us. I finished with the herbs and moved to check the building's security, but it won't stop them if they really want to get in. Deputy George was still shaking from his encounter in the desert. I need to tell you what I saw out there. When they took Nicholas has been dead for 3 years, Sheriff Damien said gently. Not Nicholas Barrett. Nicholas Cole, new guy, started last week. They got him, but... George ran his hands through his hair. The thing that took him, it looked like me. Exactly like me. It was wearing my face. Elena made a small sound of distress. That's not possible. A lot of impossible things are happening tonight, I said. George, where did this happen? Mile marker 7 on Thunder Mountain Road. I was responding to a call about stranded motorists. When I got there, I found my own patrol car already at the scene. I watched myself get out and talk to Nicholas. And then I watched myself. He shuddered. It wasn't me, but it was perfect. Even the way I walk, the way I hold my shoulders. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If they could perfectly mimic appearance as well as voice, if they could replicate our vehicles and equipment, then we couldn't trust anything we saw outside these walls. Sheriff, I said, I need to make a call. I dialed Harrison Bigay's number, hoping the old man would answer. The phone rang 5 times before his familiar voice came through. I was expecting your call, he said without preamble. Mr. Bigay, they're hunting in packs. They can mimic appearance perfectly. We're trapped in the Sedona substation with hostile contacts surrounding the building. How many of you? 14. Mixed law enforcement. Too many. They'll pick you off one by one if you stay together. Harrison's voice was calm, matter of fact. You need to split up, make them divide their attention. That sounds like suicide. Staying together is suicide. They're patient. They'll wait until you're exhausted, until someone makes a mistake. Then they'll kill you all. I heard papers rustling on his end of the line. There's a place you need to reach. Red Rock State Park, the visitor center. It's built on ground that was sacred long before the park existed. They can't cross the threshold. How do we get there without them picking us off? Some of you won't make it, but some might. It's the only chance you have. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a moment before turning back to the others. Sheriff Damien was studying the map, calculating distances and routes. The deputies were checking their weapons, their faces grim but determined. "What did he say?" Elena asked. "We need to reach Red Rock State Park. It's our only chance." "That's 15 miles, Sheriff Damien protested. "Through open desert at night with those things out there hunting us." "If we stay here, we die," I said simply. "If we try to reach the park, some of us might live." Deputy Zachary spoke up from his position by the radio. "I'm getting calls from all over the county. Missing persons reports, strange sightings, people reporting family members who've been acting wrong." "They're expanding their operation," Elena said. "This isn't just about Sedona anymore." Sheriff Damien made his decision. "We split into 3 groups. Take separate routes to the park. Group with the best luck calls for backup once they reach safety." "Sheriff," I said carefully, "we need to consider the possibility that some of us aren't who we appear to be." The room went silent. Everyone looked at everyone else with new suspicion, with the terrible understanding that any one of us could be a perfect predator wearing a familiar face. "How do we verify?" Deputy Chase asked. I thought about what Harrison had told me, about the old ways and the protections that had kept his people safe for generations. Personal information that would be difficult for an outsider to know. Childhood memories, family details, things that aren't in any file. We spent the next 20 minutes questioning each other, painful, intimate details that proved our humanity. It was Elena who asked me about the scar on my left hand, and when I correctly explained that I'd gotten it at age 7 trying to rescue a kitten from a barbed wire fence, I saw the relief in her eyes. But as we prepared to leave the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, that one of the shapes moving through the darkness outside wasn't what it appeared to be. We divided into 3 groups, Sheriff Damien with Deputies Chase and George heading north through the main canyon. Deputy Zachary with 2 state troopers, Maxwell and Diego, taking the southern route. Elena and I, along with Deputy Cole, would follow the eastern path through the desert. "If anyone doesn't make it," Sheriff Damien said, "tell our families we died fighting." "We're not dead yet," Elena said firmly. We slipped out of the station through the rear exit, moving in single file toward our designated route. The desert night was clear and cold, with enough moonlight to navigate by. But the silence was absolute. No insects, no small animals, no wind through the cacti. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound. We'd made it maybe half a mile when Cole stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I listened. In the distance, carried on the still air, I could hear voices. Familiar voices calling our names with increasing urgency. "Help! Over here, we're trapped!" It was Sheriff Damien's voice, and Chase's voice, and George's voice. "They got the others," Cole said, starting to move toward the sounds. Elena grabbed his arm. "No, that's not them." "But listen," I said. "How many voices do you hear?" Cole concentrated. 3, the sheriff and his group. All calling for help at the same time. All from the same location. Even if they were in trouble, they wouldn't all be shouting simultaneously. They'd designate one person to call for backup while the others provided security. Cole's face went pale as understanding dawned. "They're trying to draw us in. Which means the real Sheriff Damien and his team are either dead or—" I didn't finish the thought. We continued east, moving as quietly as possible through the scattered juniper and prickly pear. Red Rock State Park was still 12 miles away, and dawn was at least 6 hours off. The carved bone in my pocket had been warm since we left the station, but now it was getting hot enough to be painful. That's when we saw the lights, flashlight beams, moving through the desert parallel to our position. At first I thought it might be the real sheriff's group, but as the lights drew closer I could see there were too many of them. At least 8 beams, moving in perfect formation like a military patrol. "Down," I whispered, and we dropped behind a cluster of barrel cacti. The lights passed within 50 yards of our position. In their glow I could make out human figures, men in law enforcement uniforms carrying standard-issue equipment. They looked exactly right, moved exactly right, even spoke in the quiet professional tones of trained officers conducting a search. But something was wrong with their shadows. In the shifting beams of their flashlights, their shadows didn't match their movements. They bent at impossible angles, stretched too far, moved independently of the figures that cast them. Elena squeezed my arm and pointed. One of the figures had stopped and was looking directly at our hiding place. In the moonlight, its face was perfectly human, except for the eyes which reflected light like an animal's. It opened its mouth and spoke in Sheriff Damien's voice. "I know you're out there. We just want to help." None of us moved. None of us breathed. After what felt like hours, the figure turned and rejoined the patrol. They continued south, their lights fading into the distance. "Jesus Christ," Cole whispered. "What are they?" "Hunters," I said. "And we're the prey." We pressed on through the desert, staying low and moving carefully. The terrain was rough. Loose rock, hidden arroyos, cacti that seemed to reach out and tear at our clothing. But we were making progress. By my estimate, we were about halfway to the park when Elena called for a halt. "Something's wrong," she said. "What do you mean?" She pointed back the way we'd come. "Look at our tracks." I knelt and examined the ground behind us. Our footprints were clearly visible in the sandy soil, but there were other impressions beside them. Larger prints with an odd gait that seemed almost but not quite human. "How long have those been there?" Cole asked. "I don't know, but there are at least 3 sets." I stood and scanned the horizon. "We're being followed." That's when we heard the howling. It started as a single voice somewhere behind us in the darkness. Then another joined it and another, until the desert rang with a chorus that was almost but not quite the sound of wolves. It was too organized, too purposeful, too full of intelligence to be entirely animal. "They're calling to each other," Elena said. "Coordinating." "Run," I said. We abandoned stealth and sprinted across the desert, stumbling over rocks and crashing through brush. Behind us, the howling grew closer, and I could hear the sound of pursuit. Footsteps that came too fast covered too much ground with each stride. Cole went down first, his foot catching in a hidden hole. I heard his ankle snap from 20 feet away, saw him roll and come up with his weapon drawn. "Keep going," he shouted. "I'll hold them off." "Cole, no!" His first shot lit up the night, and in the muzzle flash I saw something that made me grab Elena's hand and drag her forward at a dead run. The thing approaching Cole was human-shaped but wrong in every detail. Too tall, joints that bent the wrong way, fingers that were too long and ended in claws. Cole's second shot was followed by a scream that cut off abruptly. Elena and I ran through the darkness, our lungs burning and our legs cramping, while behind us the sounds of feeding filled the night. We didn't stop until we saw lights ahead. The blessed sight of the Red Rock State Park Visitor Center, its windows glowing with warm electric light. We collapsed against the building's front door, gasping for breath. The carved bone in my pocket had gone cold for the first time in hours. "Are we safe?" Elena asked. Before I could answer, we heard a familiar voice calling from the darkness behind us. "Elena, thank God you made it." It was Cole's voice, warm with relief and completely uninjured. Elena started toward the sound, but I held her back. "Cole's dead," I whispered. "We both heard him die," the voice called again, closer now. "Elena, it's me." "I got away." "I'm hurt. I need help." In the glow from the visitor center windows, I could see a figure limping toward us across the desert. It looked exactly like Cole. Same height, same uniform, same face. Even the way it favored its left leg matched the injury we'd seen him sustain. But its shadow was wrong, stretching too far and bending at angles that defied the light source. Elena raised her weapon. "That's not Cole." The figure stopped, maybe 30 yards away. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note of hurt confusion that was perfectly human. "Elena, it's me. I don't understand why you're pointing that gun at me." "Because you're not you," she said steadily. "You're something wearing his face." The thing that looked like Cole stood motionless for a long moment. Then slowly it began to smile, a smile that was too wide, showing too many teeth. "Clever girl," it said in Cole's voice. "But you can't stay in there forever." Dawn was still hours away. The thing wearing Cole's face circled the visitor center for the rest of the night. Sometimes it walked upright, maintaining the perfect illusion of our fallen colleague. Other times, when it thought we couldn't see clearly through the windows, it moved differently, on all fours, with a fluid grace that no human could achieve. Elena and I had barricaded ourselves inside the center's main exhibit hall, using everything we could find to block the doors and windows. The building felt safe in a way I couldn't quite explain. The air itself seemed different, cleaner, charged with some kind of protective energy that made my grandmother's pendant warm against my chest. Talk to me, Elena said around 3 a.m. Tell me something real, something human. I understood what she meant. After hours of listening to Cole's voice pleading from the darkness, after watching shadows move in ways that defied physics, we both needed to anchor ourselves to reality. My grandmother used to make fry bread every Sunday, I said. She'd start before dawn and the smell would fill the whole house. She said the recipe came from her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother all the way back to before the Long Walk. The Long Walk? When the government forced the Navajo people from their homeland to internment camps in New Mexico. Shall we for, my family lost everything, their land, their sheep, their traditional way of life. But they kept the recipes, the stories, the knowledge of how to protect themselves from things that hunt in the darkness. Elena was quiet for a moment. Is that what we're dealing with? Some kind of ancient evil? I think we're dealing with people who chose to become something else, who traded their humanity for power and became... I gestured toward the window, where Cole's silhouette was visible against the starlight. That. Around 4 a.m. the attacks began. It started with voices, dozens of them calling to us from every direction. I heard my own mother's voice begging me to open the door. Elena heard her sister, supposedly calling from Colorado with news of a family emergency. We heard Sheriff Damien, deputies Chase and George, even people who should have been hundreds of miles away. But we didn't respond. We couldn't. Because mixed in with the familiar voices were others, people we'd never met, speaking in languages we didn't recognize, calling out names that had no meaning to us. The things outside were losing focus, cycling through every voice they'd ever stolen without discrimination. Then came the physical attacks. Something struck the building's north wall with enough force to shake the entire structure, then the south wall, then the windows, testing each one with methodical precision. Glass cracked but didn't break. The windows were reinforced, designed to withstand the occasional flash flood that roared through the desert. They're looking for weak points, Elena observed. They won't find any. This place is built on sacred ground. How can you be sure? I pulled out my cell phone and showed her a photo I'd taken earlier that evening, before our world had turned into a nightmare. It was a picture of the visitor center's information plaque, describing the area's cultural significance to local Native American tribes. The Yavapai and Apache peoples considered this area a place of power, I read aloud. Traditional stories speak of it as neutral ground where no violence could occur. Early settlers reported that even warring tribes would lay down their weapons when they entered this valley. A tremendous crash shook the building, followed by the sound of claws scraping against metal. They were on the roof now, testing the structural integrity of everything above us. How long until sunrise? Elena asked. I checked my watch. 2 hours. Will sunrise help? I don't know. My grandmother's stories were never clear about that. Sometimes the monsters retreated at dawn. Sometimes they didn't. Another crash, this one accompanied by the sound of tearing metal. A section of roofing had been peeled back, and through the gap I could see stars and shapes moving against them, blocking out constellations as they passed overhead. They're coming through the roof, Elena said. I grabbed my pack and pulled out the remaining herbs Harrison had given me. Help me spread these around the room. Make a complete circle. We scattered the sacred mixture across the floor, creating a protective barrier in the center of the exhibit hall. The scent was stronger now, sage and sweet grass and something else that seemed to clear my head and steady my nerves. That's when the first one dropped through the hole in the roof. Landed in the far corner of the room, silent as a cat despite what must have been a 20-foot drop. In the dim emergency lighting, it looked human. A middle-aged man in civilian clothes, perhaps a hiker who'd been caught by the pack earlier in the week. Help me, it said in a perfectly normal voice. Please, I'm hurt. I've been running all night. Elena kept her weapon trained on it, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. The thing looked completely human, frightened, exhausted, desperate. If I hadn't watched Cole die and then seen his doppelganger circling our refuge, I might have believed it myself. What's your name? I asked. Tristan. Tristan Walker. I was camping at Oak Creek when they attacked. Everyone else is dead. The thing took a step closer, favoring its left leg as if injured. Please, I just want to go home. Tristan, Elena said carefully, can you tell us what day it is? The thing smiled, a warm, grateful expression that looked completely genuine. Thursday. Thursday the 18th. Thank God you're here. I thought I was going to die out there. It was Saturday the 20th. Elena pulled the trigger 3 times, center mass. The bullets struck the creature and passed through without effect, embedding themselves in the wall behind it. The thing looked down at its chest with mild curiosity, as if wondering where the blood should be. "That wasn't very nice," it said in Tristan's voice. Then it began to change. The human features melted away like wax, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process completely. I caught glimpses. Too many joints, skin that wasn't quite skin, eyes that reflected light like mirrors, before my vision blurred and nausea overwhelmed me. Elena grabbed my arm and dragged me backward into the herb circle. The moment we crossed the barrier, the creature stopped its advance. It paced around the perimeter like a caged animal, testing the boundary but unable to cross it. "Interesting," it said, and now its voice was something between human speech and the sound of wind through dry leaves. "Old magic. Older than my kind. We remember when your grandmother's people first learned to use such protections." "What do you want?" I asked. "What we have always wanted. To feed, to grow strong, to reclaim the world from the soft things that have forgotten how to be afraid." The creature settled back on its haunches, adopting an almost conversational pose. "Your people built cities believing walls could protect them. They made laws believing rules could bind us. They forgot that there are older laws, older hungers." More shapes dropped through the hole in the roof. 5, then 6, then too many to count. They formed a circle around our protective barrier, their borrowed faces shifting and changing like reflections in disturbed water. "Why now?" Elena asked. "Why come out of hiding?" One of them, wearing Sheriff Damien's face but speaking in a child's voice, answered, "Because someone called us. Someone with knowledge, someone who remembered the old ways. They offered us a bargain." "What kind of bargain?" "Fresh hunting grounds in exchange for services. They wanted certain people eliminated, certain areas cleared. They thought they could control us." The thing that had been Tristan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "They thought we were weapons that could be aimed and fired. But you're not. We are hunger given form. We take what we want when we want it. And what we want now is to feed until the fear returns to your kind. Until you remember what it means to be prey." I looked at my watch. 1 hour until dawn. The protective circle would hold, I was certain of that, but what happened when the sun came up? Would they retreat, or would they simply wait for us to emerge? The answer came from an unexpected source. My radio, which had been silent since we'd reached the visitor center, suddenly crackled to life. But instead of a human voice, it emitted a sound like static, mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the wind through pine trees, of water flowing over stone. The creatures around our circle reacted immediately, their borrowed faces turning toward the sound with what looked like fear. "No," one of them whispered. "Not now. We're not ready." The static resolved into something that might have been a voice, ancient, speaking in a language that predated English by thousands of years. I couldn't understand the words, but their meaning seemed to flow directly into my mind. "The compact is broken. The boundaries are restored. Return to the shadow places." The things that had been hunting us began to retreat, backing away from our circle with obvious reluctance. But they weren't moving toward the hole in the roof. They were fading, becoming translucent, dissolving into the shadows cast by the emergency lighting. "This isn't over," the Tristan thing said as it became little more than a whisper in the air. "The one who called us still lives. The bargain can be renewed." Within minutes, we were alone in the damaged visitor center. The radio fell silent, leaving only the normal sounds of the desert night. Insects chirping, small animals moving through the brush, the distant howl of actual coyotes. Elena looked at me with exhausted eyes. "What just happened?" I tried to organize my thoughts. "I think there are older powers in this land. Things that were here before the skinwalkers, before the tribes, before anything human. And I think they just reasserted their authority." We waited until full sunrise before leaving the visitor center. The desert looked normal in daylight, beautiful, peaceful, showing no signs of the nightmare we'd endured. But I noticed that the wildlife was still absent, and the air had a charged quality that reminded me of the moments before a thunderstorm. Elena's radio worked now, connecting us with the state police dispatcher and Flagstaff. Search and rescue teams were already mobilizing to look for the missing officers and civilians. I gave them coordinates for where we'd last seen Cole, though I didn't mention what we'd really encountered in the darkness. As we waited for pickup, Elena asked the question I'd been dreading. What did that thing mean about someone calling them? Someone who made a bargain? I thought about the surgical precision of the cattle killings, about the timing of the attacks, about the coordinated nature of the hunt. Someone with knowledge of the old ways. Someone who knew how to contact them and thought they could control what happened next. Any ideas who? Before I could answer, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar. "This is Dr. Lewis Haley from the Biological Survey Institute," the man said. "I understand you've had some unusual wildlife incidents in your area. I'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss our ongoing research into anomalous predator behavior." Exchanged a look with Elena. The Biological Survey Institute was a front organization I'd heard rumors about. Government groups that investigated things that didn't fit into conventional categories, Dr. Haley, I said carefully. "What makes you think our incidents are connected to your research?" "Let's just say we've been monitoring certain activities in the Four Corners region. Activities that suggest someone has been attempting to weaponize indigenous folklore for purposes that go far beyond academic study." The pieces began falling into place. Someone with government connections, someone with access to classified research, someone who thought they could turn ancient horrors into controllable assets. "Where would you like to meet?" I asked. "There's a diner in Flagstaff, Barrett's Family Restaurant on Route 66. Can you be there this afternoon?" Barrett's, the same last name as the deputy whose voice we'd heard on the radio, the deputy who'd been dead for 3 years. I was beginning to understand. That last night had been just the beginning. "We'll be there," I said. As the rescue helicopter appeared on the horizon, Elena grabbed my arm. "Are you sure about this? Meeting with some mysterious government scientist?" I touched my grandmother's pendant, feeling its familiar warmth. "Someone called those things out of the shadows. Someone made a deal that put innocent people in danger. We need to find out who, and then what." I looked out at the desert, at the ancient landscape that held so many secrets in its red rocks and hidden canyons. Somewhere out there, the skinwalkers were waiting in the shadow places, ready to resume their hunt if the opportunity arose. Then we make sure it never happens again. The helicopter landed in a swirl of dust and noise, but as we climbed aboard, I could have sworn I heard something else. A voice carried on the wind, speaking in my grandmother's language, offering a blessing for the road ahead. The hunt was over, but our real work was just beginning.